Nathan Walker had broken wild horses, survived 3 Wyoming winters alone, and buried his father with dry eyes. But the morning he stood at that altar and watched Eleanor Hayes walk toward him, a woman the whole town called unwanted, a woman he'd never spoken to before. Tuesday, something cracked open in his chest that no amount of hard living had ever touched. She didn't look desperate. She didn't look grateful. She looked at him like she already knew exactly what she was worth, and was simply waiting to see if he was man enough to figure it out. He wasn't. Not yet. But God help him, he was going to try. If this story already has you feeling something, subscribe to our channel and comment the name of your city below. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now stay with me, because what happens next will surprise you. Wyoming Territory, October 1886. The morning Nathan Walker rode into town to sign his life away, the sky was the color of an old bruise, purple and yellow, and mean the kind of sky that told you winter wasn't coming. It was already here. He didn't want to be in Red Willow Creek. He didn't want to be anywhere near that courthouse, that church, or that town council that had spent the last 3 weeks deciding his future like it was theirs to decide. But Nathan Walker had run out of options 6 weeks ago, and he was only just now admitting it to himself. He tied his horse outside the general store and stood on the wooden walkway for a long moment, looking down the main street of the town he'd avoided for most of the last decade. Red Willow Creek wasn't much a post office, a saloon, a feed store, a church with a crooked steeple that had been crooked for as long as anyone could remember. Maybe 200 people if you counted the families who lived on the outskirts and came in for Sunday services. 200 people who were all apparently very interested in what Nathan Walker was going to do next. He could feel their eyes already. He walked into the land office and dropped his hat on the counter. "Walker," said Gerald Holt, the land commissioner, without looking up from his papers. Gerald was a small man with ink-stained fingers and the kind of smile that never quite reached his eyes. "Glad you could make it." "You didn't give me much choice, Gerald." Gerald set his pen down. "The Federal Emergency Assistance Program has requirements, Nathan. I don't write the rules." "You enforce them cheerfully enough." Gerald had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. "The program requires that the applicant be a married man with established household ties to the property. It's about stability. The government wants to know the land is going to be maintained long-term. I've maintained that land for 15 years. Alone." Gerald folded his hands on the desk. "They want to see roots, Nathan. A family. Something worth protecting." Nathan was quiet for a moment. Outside, a wagon rolled past. A dog barked twice and went silent. "And Eleanor Hayes," Nathan said finally. "That was the council's idea." Gerald shifted in his chair. "She's a good woman. Capable. She's been on her own for a long time, and she's—" "Why her specifically?" Nathan's voice was flat, not angry, just flat in the way that meant he was working hard not to be angry. Gerald looked at the wall behind Nathan's head. "She was available and willing." Nathan picked up his hat. "Willing," he repeated. "That's a fine recommendation for a wife." He left before Gerald could answer. Nathan hadn't planned to meet Eleanor before the wedding. The council had arranged everything: a small ceremony at the church, a brief signing of papers, a handshake from the mayor. Clean and simple, they said. Practical. No need to make it into more than it was. But when Nathan was crossing the street toward the church the morning of the ceremony, he heard a voice behind him say, "Mr. Walker." He turned. She was standing outside the dressmaker's shop, holding a paper-wrapped parcel under one arm. She wasn't what he'd expected. He didn't know exactly what he'd expected. Desperate, maybe. Trembling. Someone so grateful for any arrangement that she'd agree to anything. Eleanor Hayes was none of those things. She was a woman of maybe 30 years with dark eyes that were direct in a way that made most people uncomfortable, and a way of holding herself that suggested she had long ago stopped caring whether people found her comfortable or not. She was plain in the way a good knife was plain, no ornamentation, nothing wasted, built for use and built to last. She looked at him the way you'd look at a problem you were calculating. "I wanted to speak with you before we go inside," she said, "if that's all right." Nathan glanced at the church. "We have about 10 minutes. That's enough." She shifted the parcel to her other arm. "I want to be honest with you about something." "All right. I'm not doing this because I'm desperate." She said it without embarrassment, the way someone states a fact about the weather. "I know what people are saying. I know what the council told you about me, and I know what this arrangement looks like from the outside. But I want you to understand from the beginning that I am not a woman who is marrying you because I have no other option." Nathan studied her face. "Then why are you marrying me?" Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "Because I've been living in this town for 8 years, and I'm tired of living like a ghost in it. I want land. I want a home that belongs to me, not a room I rent above somebody else's kitchen. I want to build something." She paused. "And because a man came to me and said you were a fair person, who worked hard and didn't have a cruel bone in his body. That's more than most women get to know before they say yes." Nathan was quiet for a long moment. "Who told you that?" The faintest smile crossed her face. "Your foreman, Mr. Henley." Old Tom Henley, Nathan thought. "I'm going to fire that man." "I should tell you something too," Nathan said. "I'm not looking for a wife. I'm looking to keep my land. This arrangement is a business arrangement," Eleanor said. "I understand completely. I want to make sure we're saying the same thing. We are." She looked at him steadily. "You keep your ranch. I get a home and a stake in the land. We treat each other with basic decency. Neither of us expects the other to become something they're not." Nathan looked at her for another moment. "That's a reasonable arrangement," he said. "I thought so," she said. "Shall we go in?" The church held maybe 60 people. Nathan had expected it to be small. He hadn't invited anyone, and Eleanor didn't have family in the area. But Red Willow Creek, it turned out, had opinions about this wedding, and opinions needed an audience. People Nathan barely recognized filed into those pews like it was the best show in 3 counties. He recognized the Hartley brothers from the South Ridge. 2 men who had never spoken a civil word to him in their lives, sitting in the 3rd row with their arms crossed and expressions of barely concealed delight. He recognized Mrs. Patricia Voss, who ran the seamstress shop and was the primary engine of every rumor that had ever moved through this town. Leaning over to whisper something to the woman beside her the moment Nathan walked in, he recognized Calvin Brooks. Calvin Brooks was the kind of man who appeared in every small town like a bad tooth, established, entrenched, painful to remove, and constantly reminding you of his presence. He had money. He had the mayor's ear. He had a seat on the town council and opinions about everyone in a 50-mile radius. He was seated in the front row on the groom's side, which Nathan hadn't agreed to and didn't understand, and he was watching the door with the expression of a man who had come specifically to be entertained. Nathan stood at the altar and stared at the crooked cross on the wall and breathed slowly. The Reverend, a quiet man named Aldous Crane, who had the good grace to look embarrassed by the whole situation, kept his eyes on his Bible. Then the door at the back of the church opened, and Eleanor Hayes walked in. She had changed into a dress dark blue. Simple cut. Nothing that would have cost much money, but nothing that looked cheap either. Her hair was arranged neatly. She held a small bunch of dried wildflowers in her hands, the kind you found in autumn, when everything else had given up for the season, and she was holding them like they mattered. She walked down that aisle with her spine straight and her eyes forward, not looking at the people in the pews, not looking at the ones who were already whispering. She looked at Nathan, and when she reached the altar and stood beside him, she said quietly, "Just for him." "I know neither of us chose this." Nathan nodded once. "But I promise," she continued, "I will never make you regret treating me with respect." He looked at her face. He had expected so many things from this woman: embarrassment, desperation, the worn-down look of someone who had been told for too long that they weren't worth choosing. He hadn't expected the way she carried herself. He hadn't expected her to sound like someone who had already decided the terms of her own dignity and wasn't negotiating. "Reverend," Nathan said, "let's get on with it." Halfway through the ceremony, Calvin Brooks leaned over to the man beside him and said something that produced a short, ugly laugh. Nathan heard it. Eleanor heard it. Neither of them reacted. But Nathan filed it away, in the careful, deliberate way he filed away everything important, quietly, thoroughly, and with the full intention of remembering it later. When Reverend Crane said the words, and Nathan slipped the plain band onto Eleanor's finger, the church was so quiet you could hear the October wind pressing against the walls. Then Calvin Brooks started clapping. It was the kind of clapping that wasn't applause. It was slow and rhythmic and mean. "Congratulations, Walker," he called from the pew. "You got yourself a wife at last, even if it took the whole town council to arrange it." Someone laughed. Someone else shushed them. Nathan turned slowly from the altar. He looked at Calvin Brooks for a long, unhurried moment. "Thank you for coming, Calvin," he said. His voice was perfectly even. "Next time there's a wedding in this church, try to remember which pew the guest of honor is supposed to sit in." Calvin's smile didn't falter, but something behind his eyes shifted. Nathan turned back to the Reverend. "Are we done?" "We are," Reverend Crane said, and he looked like a man who needed a drink. "Good," Nathan said. He offered Eleanor his arm. "Mrs. Walker." Eleanor looked at his arm. Then she looked at his face. She was reading him, he realized, trying to figure out if it was a performance or something else. She took his arm. They walked out of that church together, and the crowd parted for them, and nobody else said a word. The ride back to the Walker Ranch was about 4 miles, and they spent most of it in silence. Nathan drove the wagon. Eleanor sat beside him with her parcel in her lap and watched the landscape move past the flat stretch of valley floor, the distant tree line, where the mountains began the sky that was already starting to darken at the edges, though it was barely past noon. "The room at the end of the hall," Nathan said after a while. "That'll be yours. There's a lock on the door. I had Tom fix it this morning." Eleanor glanced at him. "You had the lock fixed before the wedding?" "Yes. That was thoughtful." "It was practical," he said. "We set terms this morning. This is what living by those terms looks like." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Will your men give me trouble?" "About what?" "About me. About what they think this arrangement is. About what they've heard in town." Nathan kept his eyes on the road. "Tom Henley runs the men. If Tom accepts you, they'll accept you. Tom already thinks highly of you for reasons I don't fully understand." "I helped his wife last spring," Eleanor said. "When she was sick, I sat with her 3 nights while he was working." Nathan was quiet. He hadn't known that. He hadn't known Eleanor Hayes at all, he was realizing, and he'd already agreed to spend his life next to her. "All right," he said finally. "Tom will help you find your footing." "I don't need help finding my footing," she said, not sharply, just plainly. "I need to know where the property lines are, where the accounts are kept, and what your outstanding debts look like." Nathan looked at her. "What? If we're going to run this place," Eleanor said, "I need to understand it. All of it, not just the house, the whole operation." Nathan turned back to the road. He was quiet for a long time. "The accounts are in the top drawer of the desk in the study," he said finally. "I'll show you the property lines tomorrow, weather permitting." Eleanor nodded. "Thank you." "Don't thank me," he said. "If you find something that's been costing me money, I expect you to tell me." "Of course." A pause. "That's the arrangement." "That's the arrangement," he agreed. The wagon rolled on. The wind came down off the mountains and smelled like pine and ice, and the particular cold that meant the season was genuinely finally turning. Nathan Walker and Eleanor Hayes arrived at the Walker Ranch as husband and wife, and neither of them knew quite what to do with that. Tom Henley was waiting on the porch. He was a man in his late 50s who had been working the Walker land for 20 years, first for Nathan's father, and then for Nathan himself. And he had the kind of face that had settled into its expressions so deeply that even when he was being polite, you could tell exactly what he actually thought. Right now he was looking at Eleanor with something that was almost not quite but almost hope. He took off his hat. "Mrs. Walker." "Mr. Henley," Eleanor said. "It's good to put a face to the name." "Likewise." He glanced at Nathan, then back at Eleanor. "I've got coffee on. Figured you might want it after the drive." "That's very kind," Eleanor said. "I'll take you up on that in a moment. First, I'd like to see the kitchen." Tom blinked. "The kitchen?" "The whole house eventually, but the kitchen first." She looked at Nathan. "Is that all right?" "It's your house," Nathan said. Something moved across her face, at that something brief and complicated that he didn't quite catch before it was gone. "Show me the kitchen, Mr. Henley," she said. Tom showed her the kitchen. Nathan went to the barn and spent 45 minutes doing things that didn't need doing because he couldn't quite figure out what to do with himself inside his own house. That evening, Eleanor cooked. This surprised Nathan, though he couldn't have said exactly why. He realized he'd assumed a great deal about this woman based on almost no information, that she'd be uncertain in an unfamiliar kitchen. Tentative. Maybe apologetic. Instead, she produced a meal from the modest supplies available: salt pork, winter squash potatoes from the root cellar, dried herbs from a paper packet she'd apparently brought in that parcel of hers. That was better than anything Nathan had eaten in the better part of a year. Tom ate 3 helpings and looked at Eleanor like she had personally resolved every concern he'd ever had about this arrangement. The 2 young ranch hands who ate with them, Billy Marsh, 19, who was Nathan's newest hire, and still nervous about everything, and a quiet man named Ruiz, who had been with the operation for 3 years, both ate silently and didn't look directly at Eleanor, which was their version of respectful uncertainty. After dinner, when the men had filed out and it was just the 2 of them at the kitchen table, Nathan said, "You cook like someone who's done it for a lot of people." "I have," Eleanor said. She was clearing the plates. "I worked for 6 years at the Marston boarding house in Cheyenne before I came to Red Willow Creek. Cooked for 12 boarders 3 times a day." "Why'd you leave?" She paused. Not long, just a breath. "The work was fine. The owner decided it wasn't appropriate for a woman my age to still be unmarried, and started suggesting it was affecting the reputation of his establishment." Nathan stared at her. "He let you go because you weren't married. He gave me 2 weeks' notice and a letter of recommendation that described me as competent but temperamentally unsuited to long-term domestic arrangements." She set the plates down and looked at him with the expression of someone who had long since processed the anger and arrived at something more durable. "That was 4 years ago. I came to Red Willow Creek because a school teacher position was advertised. By the time I arrived, the position had been filled. But I had enough savings to rent a room, and I made myself useful, and I stayed." Nathan was quiet. "Made yourself useful how?" "Accounts, letters, reading to people who couldn't read, writing for people who couldn't write, nursing when someone was sick." She went back to clearing the table. "Small things, things that needed doing." "The town calls you an old maid," Nathan said. He said it bluntly, not cruelly the way he said difficult things, because there was no point dancing around them. Eleanor picked up the last plate. "The town calls me many things," she said. "I've learned that what the town calls you and what you are don't have much to do with each other." She took the plates to the wash basin and began working. Nathan sat at the table for a long moment. Then he picked up a dish towel and went to help dry. Eleanor looked at him surprised for the first time that day, genuinely surprised. "I'm not entirely without manners," he said. "No," she said after a moment. "I can see that." They washed the dishes in silence, and it was the most peaceful Nathan had felt in months. 3 days into the marriage, Eleanor found the account books. Not the ones Nathan had pointed her toward, the operational accounts in the top drawer. The other ones. The old ledgers from his father's era, bundled with twine and shoved to the back of the lowest shelf in the study behind a broken saddle rack Nathan had never gotten around to fixing. She didn't say anything immediately. She sat in the study for 2 hours, working through them, while Nathan was out checking the south fence line. And when he came back, she was still there, and there was a piece of paper in front of her, covered in her neat, precise handwriting. Nathan stood in the doorway, still wearing his coat, still cold from the wind. "What are you doing?" "Looking at your father's contracts with the Hendricks Supply Company." She didn't look up. "Did you know they've been charging you the original 1871 rate for feed and lumber adjusted for what they call regional delivery costs?" That's what the contract said. The contract said they could adjust for regional delivery, yes. It didn't authorize them to increase that adjustment by 14% every 3 years, regardless of actual delivery costs. She looked up then. "Nathan, they've been taking money from this ranch for 15 years. Since before your father died." Nathan crossed the room slowly. He stood behind her and looked at the paper she'd written. The number at the bottom was significant. "That can't be right," he said. "I've checked it 4 times. She turned to look at him. "It's right." He stared at the numbers. Something that had been tight in his chest for a very long time began doing something complicated. "My father trusted Gerald Hendricks." "Gerald Hendricks took advantage of a man who trusted him," Eleanor said. There was no cruelty in her voice, just the flat truth of it. "It happens to good people. He's been doing the same thing to me." "Yes, but you can stop it. I've drafted a letter to the Territorial Land Office. If you want, I can also write to the Federal Agricultural Bureau and request an audit that's within your rights as an assistance program applicant." She paused. "It won't fix everything, but it will help." Nathan pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. He looked at her face, at the careful, contained expression she wore, at the ink on her fingers, at the fact that this woman had been in his house for 3 days and had already found a problem he'd been losing money to for 15 years. "Why?" he said. She looked at him. "Why what? Why are you doing this?" He gestured at the papers. "The arrangement was that you'd manage the house, run the kitchen, help with the accounts at a basic level. This," he gestured again, "this isn't what we agreed to." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "We agreed that I would be useful," she said, "and that you would treat me with respect. I'm being useful. I don't see the contradiction." "Eleanor." He said her name for the first time, and she registered it. He could see her register it just slightly. Nobody does this kind of work for someone they barely know without wanting something from it. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I want a home. I want to know that the place I'm living in will still exist in 5 years. I want to know that the man I married isn't going to lose everything to a corrupt supplier while I'm watching." She folded her hands on the table. "That's what I want from it. Is that acceptable?" Nathan looked at her for a long moment. "Send the letter," he said. The response came from the Territorial Land Office in 11 days. It was, if anything, more damning than Eleanor had expected. The Hendricks Supply Company had been operating the same scheme across at least 4 other ranches in the valley. The inflated delivery charges were a well-worn pattern. The land office wanted documentation, which Eleanor had already organized, and a sworn statement from Nathan, which he gave without hesitation. Gerald Hendricks arrived at the Walker Ranch on a Tuesday morning, looking like a man who had rehearsed his explanations all night and still hadn't found the right ones. Nathan met him on the porch. "Nathan," Gerald said, "now I understand there's been a misunderstanding about the billing." "There's been no misunderstanding," Nathan said. "My wife reviewed 15 years of accounts and found the discrepancy. The Territorial Office has the documentation. You have 3 weeks to arrange repayment before they file formal charges." Gerald's face went through several colors. "Your wife," he said, and the way he said it managed to fit a great deal of contempt into 2 words. "You let a woman." "I let a capable person do work she's suited for," Nathan said, "which is more than I can say for you." Gerald looked at the door behind Nathan, where he seemed to realize now Eleanor was standing quietly in the frame. "This isn't over, Walker," Gerald said. "Pay what you owe," Nathan said. Then we'll talk about what's over." Gerald left. Nathan stood on the porch for a moment after the wagon disappeared down the lane. He could feel Eleanor behind him. "He's going to make trouble," she said. "Yes. He'll talk to Calvin Brooks." "Probably. And the council." "Likely." He turned around. She was watching him carefully, the way she watched most things, like she was tracking not just what was visible, but what was underneath it. "Does that concern you?" "It concerns me for you," she said. "This is your ranch, your reputation." "It's our ranch," he said. He hadn't planned to say it, but it was the correct thing to say. Technically, she was his wife. The ranch was jointly listed on the assistance application. The terms were what they were, technically. Eleanor looked at him. "Yes," she said quietly. "It is." That night, Nathan couldn't sleep. He lay in the dark of his father's bedroom. His bedroom now, and stared at the ceiling and thought about Eleanor in the room at the end of the hall, and the lock on the door that he had put there, and the accounts on the desk in the study, and the letter she had written in her neat, careful hand. He thought about a woman who had been told for years that she was unwanted, who had been let go from her employment for being unmarried at an age someone else decided was too old, who had come to a new town and been called an old maid by people who didn't know the first thing about her, and who had responded to all of it by becoming steadily, quietly, unstoppably useful. He thought about the way she'd walked into that church, her chin up, her eyes forward. He thought about the way she'd said, "I promise I will never make you regret treating me with respect," like she had said that kind of thing before, in exactly those terms, and meant it every time, and had never once been given the chance to prove it. Nathan Walker stared at the ceiling of his bedroom in the dark and thought, what kind of town looks at a woman like that and calls her unwanted, and then quietly, carefully in the back of his mind, where he didn't quite let himself look at it directly yet? What kind of man doesn't notice what's been right in front of him? He didn't have answers to either question. But he was, for the first time in a long time, genuinely thinking about something other than the survival of his ranch. And that small, unfamiliar warmth in the back of his chest felt like the most dangerous development of all. A week later, Billy Marsh fell off the roof of the main barn. He didn't fall far 8 feet, maybe 9, but he landed wrong, and by the time Nathan got to him, the boy was white, and his arm was at an angle that turned Nathan's stomach. "Get Eleanor," Tom Henley said. Nathan ran. Eleanor was already coming through the barn door when he got there. She'd heard the noise apparently, and had the instinct that trained people develop, the kind that moved you toward trouble before you'd fully thought it through. She knelt beside Billy without hesitating. "Tell me where it hurts." "Everywhere," Billy said, which was honest. "Be more specific." She was already moving her hands along his arm with efficient, careful pressure. "Here. Yeah. Here." A sharp intake of breath. "Yeah. Okay." She sat back. "It's broken, but clean. No bone through the skin, which is good. I need cloth, something for a splint, 2 flat boards about this long." She measured the space with her hands, and someone to go into town for the doctor. "Ruiz is already going," Tom said. "Good." She looked at Nathan. "I'll need help keeping him still." Nathan knelt beside her without a word. What followed was 45 minutes of the most careful, organized work Nathan had ever watched someone do under pressure. Eleanor talked to Billy the whole time, not the falsely cheerful voice of someone trying to distract a frightened child, but actual conversation, the kind that required Billy to think and respond and be present in his own mind while Eleanor did what needed doing. "How long have you been working ranches?" she asked, splinting with efficient hands. 3 years, Billy said through his teeth. "Started down in Colorado." "Why'd you come north?" "Work." A hiss. "Heard Walker paid fair." "He does," Eleanor said with such complete matter-of-fact certainty that Nathan felt something shift in him. "You've been here 2 weeks, Billy pointed out. "Long enough," she said. Billy almost laughed despite himself. When the doctor arrived an hour later, he examined Billy's arm, found the splint perfectly positioned, and told Eleanor that she'd probably saved the boy significant complications. "She did good, huh?" Tom Henley said, and the pride in his voice was entirely unguarded. "She did very well." The doctor agreed. Eleanor was already cleaning her hands at the pump, already moving on to the next necessary thing. Nathan watched her from across the yard. He was thinking about Gerald Hendricks and Calvin Brooks and the council and the people in that church who had come to watch a failure, and he was thinking about how none of them had any idea what Eleanor Hayes was actually capable of, and he was thinking. He stopped that thought. He went back to work, but he stopped less quickly than he should have. That evening, Eleanor came to find him in the barn. He was working on a piece of tack that needed replacing something he did when he needed his hands busy and his mind quiet. She stood in the doorway for a moment before he registered her presence. "Billy's sleeping," she said. "Good." He didn't look up from the leather. "You did well today." "Thank you." A pause. "Can I ask you something?" "You'll ask whether I say yes or no, so." She didn't quite smile, but something in her face acknowledged that he wasn't wrong. "What happened to your father?" Nathan's hand slowed, then resumed. "He died 8 years ago. Heart gave out during a spring drive. He was on the North Ridge when it happened." He paused. Tom found him the next morning. "I'm sorry." "He lived the way he wanted to," Nathan said. "It wasn't a bad end." Another pause. "Why, the accounts," Eleanor said. "The old ledgers. The way he built things, he was careful, precise. He trusted people, but he documented carefully. You can see it in the way the early records look." She stopped. "Somewhere around 78, the documentation gets sloppier. Less detail. Like he stopped watching as closely." Nathan set down the leather. "He got sick that year," he said quietly, slowly. "He didn't tell many people." Eleanor nodded slowly. "That's when Hendricks started adjusting the rates." "He waited until my father was too sick to notice." "Yes." Nathan was silent. "That makes me angry," Eleanor said. "Not for the money, for your father." Nathan looked at her. She was standing in the doorway of his barn in the cold evening light, talking about his father like she'd known him, like it mattered personally, and it did matter. He realized to her not because she had to feel it, but because that was how she was built. "He would have liked you," Nathan said. The words came out before he'd examined them. Eleanor looked at him. "I mean that straightforwardly," he said. "He respected capable people." "I know what you meant," she said quietly. The wind moved through the barn. "Good night, Nathan," Eleanor said. "Good night," he said. She walked back toward the house. And Nathan Walker stood in his barn in the growing dark and felt with something close to alarm that the careful, practical, emotional distance he had built into this arrangement was already 10 days in beginning to develop cracks. He picked up the leather and went back to work. But his hands weren't quite as steady as they'd been before. The cracks Nathan had noticed in himself that night in the barn did not close. He had expected them to. He was a practical man, and practical men didn't spend time examining the unexpected warmth that developed when a woman they barely knew spoke plainly about their dead father's betrayal. Practical men set that aside and went back to work. Nathan went back to work. The cracks stayed. They showed up in small ways that he couldn't entirely ignore. The way he listened more carefully when Eleanor spoke at dinner. The way he had started without deciding to adjusting the time he came in from the fields so he wasn't arriving after she'd already cleared the table. The way Tom Henley had stopped reporting to Nathan in the morning and had started reporting to both of them as naturally as if that had always been the arrangement, and Nathan had said nothing about it because there was nothing wrong to say. Eleanor didn't seem to notice any of it. Or if she did, she was too careful to show it. That Nathan thought was either very wise or very frustrating, and he couldn't quite decide which. It was Billy Marsh who broke the surface first. 3 weeks after the fall, Billy's arm was healing well, and he'd been cleared for light work. which mostly meant he sat in the barn doing leather repairs and talked because Billy was 19 years old, and 19-year-olds fill silence with words the way water fills a low place automatically without thinking about it. Nathan was inventorying the feed supply. Billy was oiling a bridle. "Mrs. Walker taught me to read the supply ledger yesterday," Billy said. Nathan looked up. "She did. Said I should know how the numbers work if I'm going to be on this ranch long term. Said a man who can't read his own contracts is a man who can be cheated." Billy paused. She said that second part real careful, like she was talking about something specific. "She was," Nathan said. "She's not what I expected," Billy said. Nathan went back to the feed count. "What did you expect?" "I don't know. Town said she was—" Billy seemed to realize he was about to say something he hadn't fully thought through. He stopped, reconsidered. "Town said she was difficult, peculiar." "The town," Nathan said, "is wrong." Billy was quiet for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "I kind of figured that out." He went back to the bridle. "She sat with me the whole first night after the fall, after the doctor left. She didn't make a big thing of it, just stayed." Nathan set down his pencil. "I didn't know that," he said. "She told me not to mention it," Billy said. "Said you'd think she was fussing." He looked up with the guileless expression of someone who has not yet learned that some information is meant to stay where it was put. "Guess I shouldn't have mentioned it." Nathan picked up his pencil again. "No," he said. "I'm glad you did." He finished the inventory in silence, and the number in his chest that he hadn't named yet went up by 1. The trouble with Gerald Hendricks arrived sooner than Nathan had anticipated. Not in the form of repayment, Gerald was stalling on that which Nathan had expected, but in the form of a conversation that happened at the feed store when Nathan rode into town for supplies on a Wednesday morning, 12 days after the confrontation on the porch. He heard his name before he saw who was saying it. "Walker's wife is what I'm told. Woman's got her hooks into every account on that ranch. Gerald says she went through 15 years of records in 3 days. Nathan stopped outside the feed store door. "Can't blame Gerald for being irritated." A second voice, lower familiar. Calvin Brooks. "Man's been doing business that way for years. Never had an issue until that woman came along." "You think she knew what she was looking for?" "I think," Calvin said, and Nathan could hear the particular smirk in his voice, the one that meant he was about to say something he found very clever, that a woman who couldn't get herself a husband for 31 years and then suddenly talks a desperate rancher into a government-assisted marriage knows exactly how to make herself seem more valuable than she is. Nathan pushed the door open. The conversation stopped. Calvin Brooks was leaning against the counter with a coffee cup in his hand, talking to Frank Dooley, who ran the feed store and was the kind of man who collected other people's business the way some men collected coins, constantly, indiscriminately, and with great enthusiasm. Both of them looked at Nathan. "Nathan," Calvin said, with the easy confidence of a man who had never once in his life worried about being caught saying something unkind. "Good to see you." Nathan walked to the counter. He set his supply list on the wood surface and looked at Frank. "Fill this order." Frank took the list and disappeared into the back. Nathan looked at Calvin. "You were talking about my wife," Nathan said. "Just making conversation." "Say what you mean, Calvin. You usually do." Calvin set his coffee cup down. "All right. I'm saying that a woman who spent 8 years in this town without a single man expressing serious interest, and then shows up married to you inside of a week after the council arranged it. That's not a love story, Nathan. That's a transaction. And I'd be careful about how much access to your accounts you give someone who went into the arrangement looking for exactly that kind of access." Nathan was quiet for exactly long enough that Calvin seemed to think he'd won something. Then Nathan said, "Tell me something, Calvin. In the 8 years Eleanor lived in this town, did you ever speak to her directly? Have a real conversation? Learn a single thing about who she actually is?" Calvin blinked. "I know her reputation. Her reputation according to who you, Patricia Voss, The people who decided she was peculiar because she didn't spend her evenings trying to make herself agreeable to men who weren't worth her time. Nathan leaned slightly on the counter. Because I've been married to her for 3 weeks, and what I know is that she found 15 years of financial fraud on my ranch. In 3 days, she set Billy Marsh's arm better than most doctors could have, and she sat with him through the night without telling anyone because she didn't want credit for it. He paused. What's your wife done for your ranch lately, Calvin? Or is she mostly decorative? Calvin's face went red. Frank came back from the storage room, took one look at the atmosphere, and set the filled order on the counter very quietly. Nathan picked up the order. Good day, Calvin. He left. He was 3 blocks down the street before his jaw unclenched, and he realized his hands were shaking slightly, not from anger, but from something else. Something that felt uncomfortably like the need to defend Eleanor Hayes against anyone who said her name wrong, and he didn't know quite what to do with the intensity of it. He did not examine it closely. He rode home. He didn't tell Eleanor what had happened in the feed store. He decided this on the ride home, and he stuck to it. She would want to know, probably. She had a right to know. But she would respond to it with that careful, contained composure that she carried everywhere. And she would say something like, I've been hearing things like that for years, and mean it without self-pity, and Nathan found with some surprise that he couldn't stand the idea of adding one more thing to the pile of cruelties she'd apparently been absorbing in this town for 8 years. So he said nothing. He came in for dinner, and Eleanor had made something with winter vegetables and the last of the dried beef, and it was warm and good, and they ate together at the kitchen table while Billy Marsh talked about a horse he'd seen in the north field that he was fairly sure was a stray, and Ruiz said 2 words in total, as was his custom, and Tom Henley ate with the focused contentment of a man who has finally found a supper worth eating. After dinner, when the men had gone and Eleanor was doing accounts at the kitchen table, Nathan poured himself coffee and sat down across from her. Tell me about Cheyenne, he said. She looked up. What about it? The boarding house. What was it like? She studied him for a moment, trying to read why he was asking. He kept his face neutral. Busy, she said finally. Mr. Marston ran a clean house. Good reputation. We had long-term boarders men working in the land offices, a retired judge, 2 school teachers. She paused. I liked the work. I like having things to manage. Is that why you came to Red Willow Creek for the school position? Partly. She set down her pen. I taught myself out of boredom mostly, during the slow hours at the boarding house. I read every book in Mr. Marston's library. He had a good one, actually. And I started helping the boarders' children with their lessons when they visited, and I found I was good at it. You had no formal training. No, I had a great deal of time and access to books, which is a reasonable substitute. A pause. My mother taught me to read when I was very young. She believed strongly that education was not a luxury. Where are your parents now? Something moved across Eleanor's face. My mother died when I was 12. Fever. My father remarried and moved east with his new wife's family. I stayed with an aunt. She said this without particular emotion, the way people relay the facts of difficult things they've had long enough to file down smooth. I've been largely self-sufficient since I was about 15. Nathan looked at her. Eleanor, it wasn't tragic, she said with a quick firmness that suggested it had been, and she had long ago decided that the word didn't apply to her. Plenty of people manage on less. That doesn't mean it wasn't hard. She looked at him for a moment. No, she said. It was hard. And then, as if that admission surprised her, I don't usually say that. What do you usually say? That it built character. The ghost of a real smile. Which it did. So it's not entirely dishonest. Nathan wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. The town treats you like you've been here doing nothing, he said carefully. But you've been doing things this whole time. Teaching people. Managing accounts. Nursing. Tom's wife. Eleanor looked at him. You know about Sarah. Tom told me you sat with her for 3 nights. She was quiet for a moment. She was frightened. Tom had to work. There was no one else who offered. Another pause. I didn't want credit for it. People do things and then want to be seen doing them, and that changes what the thing was. I'd rather just do the thing. Nathan stared at her. He had been in business and in life with a lot of people. Ranch hands, suppliers, lawyers, bankers, council members. He had met very few people who operated the way Eleanor operated, who did the thing and didn't need anyone to see them doing it. That's a rare quality, he said. It's a practical one, she said. Credit is nice, but it doesn't fill the root cellar. He laughed. It was abrupt and genuine, and surprised him, and it clearly surprised her too, because she looked at him with something slightly wide in her expression, like she was recalibrating. You should do that more, she said. Do what? Laugh. You look like a different person. Nathan stopped laughing, but the feeling of it stayed in his chest warm and a little inconvenient. Go to sleep, Eleanor, he said. Good night, Nathan, she said, and she was smiling when she went. 2 days later, Eleanor did something that Nathan would think about for a long time afterward. He had ridden out to the eastern pasture to check on 3 yearlings that Tom had flagged as needing attention, and when he came back mid-afternoon, he heard voices he didn't recognize coming from the kitchen. He came through the back door and found Eleanor sitting at the kitchen table with a woman he'd never seen, and 2 small children, a girl of maybe 8 and a boy of 5, who were both clutching their mother's coat and looking at the floor. The woman was Lena Gruber. Nathan recognized the name, though he'd never had reason to speak to her. Her husband Hans ran a small sheep operation on the northwest edge of the valley. Struggling operation, everyone knew it, and the Gruber family kept to themselves. Lena Gruber looked like someone who had spent the last several months not sleeping. Eleanor was listening. She wasn't advising. She wasn't organizing. She was just listening with her full attention and both hands flat on the table, the way someone listens when they understand that the person talking needs to be heard before they need to be helped. Nathan stood in the doorway without speaking. Hans doesn't know I came, Lena was saying. Her voice was very quiet. He doesn't want to ask for help. He says it's our burden and we manage it ourselves. But Mrs. Walker, we have 3 weeks of food at most, and Hans, he's not... She stopped, pressed her lips together, started again. He's not thinking about next month. He's thinking about right now, and I'm thinking about the children. Of course you are, Eleanor said. I don't know what to ask for, Lena said. I don't even know why I came here. People in town said... She stopped again. What did they say? Eleanor's voice was perfectly level. Lena looked at her lap. They said that you were odd, unfriendly, that you thought you were better than people. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. And yet you came anyway, she said. Tom Henley's wife told me to come to you if I ever needed help, Lena said. Before she passed, she told me. She said you were the only person in this county who would actually help without making you feel small for asking. Nathan stood very still in the doorway. Eleanor reached across the table and put her hand over Lena's. Tell me what you need, she said. Not what Hans will accept. What your family actually needs. What followed was a careful, thorough conversation that lasted about 20 minutes, and at the end of it, Eleanor had a list. She went to the root cellar and came back with 3 different things. She wrote 2 letters, one to the Territorial Agricultural Office about the Emergency Grain Relief Program, and one to a general store in the next town over where she apparently had some kind of account requesting a specific supply order against it. She handed Lena the letters and the goods. Lena Gruber looked like someone who had been underwater and had just now found the surface. I don't know how to... she started. Don't thank me, Eleanor said. Just use it. And tell Hans to come talk to Nathan about the eastern pasture lease situation when he's ready. There may be a solution there he doesn't know about yet. After Lena had left with her children, Nathan came the rest of the way into the kitchen. Eleanor was already writing something else, a note to Tom, about the pasture lease he saw when he got close enough to read it. You used your own account, Nathan said. She didn't look up. Yes. That store order came from my savings. Yes. Eleanor. He waited until she stopped writing and looked at him. This isn't your responsibility. The Grubers aren't. Her children are hungry, Eleanor said. Simply. Like that was the beginning and end of the conversation. Nathan looked at her for a long moment. The Eastern Pasture lease, he said. You think there's a sublease arrangement that could help Gruber? I think there's about 40 acres on the northeast corner you don't use in winter. If Hans Gruber could winter his sheep there in exchange for labor in spring, it solves two problems at once. She paused. But I didn't want to commit you to something without asking. Nathan stared at her. The woman who had spent 8 years in this town being called unfriendly odd better than people. The woman who drained her own savings for a family she barely knew and told them not to thank her. The woman who was now calmly in his kitchen arranging solutions to other people's problems with the same matter-of-fact competence she brought to everything. Tell Tom to reach out to Hans, Nathan said. Eleanor nodded. I already wrote the note. I just need you to say yes first. Yes, he said. She went back to writing. Nathan poured coffee he didn't need because he needed something to do with his hands and stood at the kitchen counter for a moment, wondering what exactly he thought he had been doing for the past 8 years, with this person living 4 miles away from his front door. Kia. That evening after dark, he found Tom Henley smoking on the bunkhouse steps. Tell me something, Nathan said. Tom looked up. Ask. When you suggested Eleanor to Gerald Holt, when they were trying to figure out who I might marry. Nathan stopped. Did you know about who she actually was? Tom was quiet for a moment. I knew Sarah thought the world of her, he said. And Sarah was the best judge of a person I ever met. He paused. I also knew that you needed something, and I figured what you needed wasn't a woman who wanted things from you. It was a woman who wanted to build something. He took a slow draw. Was I wrong? Nathan was quiet. No, he said. You weren't wrong. Tom nodded once, like that settled it. She's something your wife, he said, not unkindly. She is, Nathan said. He went back inside. The twist came on a Saturday, 3 weeks into November. Nathan had ridden to town for the monthly land registry check routine procedure required under the assistance program terms, and Gerald Holt was not in his office. The door was locked. The sign said closed. That wasn't unusual. What was unusual was the man sitting in the waiting room outside Gerald's office. A man in a gray coat Nathan didn't recognize with a leather satchel, and the kind of expression that meant he worked for someone else's interests. You Nathan Walker, the man said. I am. Robert Ames out of the Denver Land Office. He held out a card. We've had some concerns raised about the application submitted for federal emergency ranch assistance by your property, specifically regarding the legitimacy of the marriage used to qualify for the program. Nathan went very still. What kind of concerns? Ames opened his satchel. We've received a formal complaint that the marriage was entered into fraudulently as a purely transactional arrangement with no legitimate marital basis for the purpose of qualifying for assistance funds. He looked up from the papers. If that's found to be accurate, Mr. Walker, the assistance program would require full repayment of any disbursed funds, and the ranch would be reclassified as non-qualifying property. Nathan looked at the papers Ames was holding. He recognized the signature at the bottom of the complaint. Gerald Hendricks, the man Nathan had publicly confronted on his own porch, the man who had 3 weeks to arrange repayment before formal charges, the man who had apparently decided that the best defense was a very specific offense. When do you need a response? Nathan said. His voice was level. I'll be in Red Willow Creek through Tuesday. I need to interview both you and your wife separately. If the marriage appears legitimate, the complaint is dismissed. If it doesn't. Ames closed the satchel. You understand the stakes. Nathan understood the stakes. He rode home faster than he'd ridden anywhere in a long time. Eleanor was in the study when he came through the door. She looked up at his face and immediately set down her pen. What happened? He told her. All of it. Ames, the complaint, the signature, the stakes. When he finished, Eleanor was very still. She was looking at the desk, not at him. He watched her think, could almost see it, the way she worked through things, methodical and quick, moving through implications like someone sorting cards. "He's trying to stop the repayment claim," she said. "Yes. If the assistance funds have to be returned and the ranch is reclassified, you can't afford the legal fees for the fraud case against him. It collapses." "Yes." She looked up. "How much of the assistance money have you already spent?" "About 40%. Feed and equipment before winter." She was quiet. "We could fight the complaint," she said. "Provide documentation, the wedding certificate, the registry, my presence on the property, the joint account." She paused. "But Ames is going to ask the question that matters. Whether this was a real marriage or a transactional arrangement. And if we answer it honestly, what did we say to each other the morning of the wedding?" Nathan said. Eleanor looked at him. He met her eyes. "You said you weren't doing it because you were desperate. You said you wanted land and a home and something to build. I said I was doing it to keep the ranch. We both said it was a business arrangement." "I know what we said. If he asks us separately what this marriage is, and we answer honestly, Gerald wins." Eleanor was very quiet. The fire made small sounds. Outside, the wind was building. "Then we have a problem," she said. Nathan looked at her steadily. "Or," he said carefully, "we have a marriage." Eleanor went completely still. Nathan had not planned to say it that way. He wasn't sure he'd planned to say it at all, but it was in the room now, sitting between them, with the particular weight of something that was true, and had been true for longer than he'd admitted, and he wasn't willing to unsay it. "Nathan," she said. Her voice was very careful. "I'm not talking about the paperwork," he said. "I'm not talking about the legal situation. I'm saying that I've been watching you for 6 weeks, and what I've seen is not a business arrangement." He paused. "I don't know when it stopped being one, but it has." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. He could see her processing it, measuring it, checking it for the way she checked everything carefully, thoroughly, without sentimentality. "You are," she said slowly, "telling me that the night before a federal investigator sits down to ask me whether this marriage is real, you've decided that it is." "The timing is unfortunate," he agreed. She stared at him. Then, and he would remember this moment for the rest of his life, the quality of it, the exact texture of the air in the room, she laughed. Not a polite laugh. Not the careful social smile she deployed in public. A real laugh, sudden and warm and slightly disbelieving, the laugh of a woman who has been handed an absurd situation by a serious man and has decided that the only possible response is to find it funny. "You could have told me this any other night," she said. "I know. Literally any other night in the last 6 weeks. I know." She pressed her hand over her mouth for a moment, collected herself, looked at him with eyes that were still bright with something he hadn't seen in them before. "I'm not good at this," Nathan said. He said it flatly, without apology, just the fact of it laid down honestly. I don't know how to do this the way other men do it. I don't have a speech. I just—" He stopped. "I trust you. I respect you. I look forward to—" Another stop. "Coming home." Eleanor was looking at him very carefully. "Nathan Walker," she said quietly. "Eleanor, if you're telling me the truth," she said, "then I need you to understand something. All right. I have been told for years that I wasn't worth choosing. By this town, by employers, by the circumstances of my life." She folded her hands on the desk, and they were completely steady, and that steadiness was both the most heartbreaking and most admirable thing he'd ever seen. "If you're saying what I think you're saying, I need you to be certain, because I can survive a federal investigation, and I can survive Gerald Hendricks, and I can survive whatever this town decides to throw at us. What I cannot—" She stopped. "What I will not survive is being chosen because the timing was convenient." The room was very quiet. Nathan looked at Eleanor Hayes. Eleanor Walker sitting behind the desk in the study of his father's ranch house, and thought about the morning she'd walked into that church with her chin up and her hands steady, and the words, "I promise I will never make you regret treating me with respect," on her lips. He thought about Billy Marsh's arm. about Lena Gruber's children, about Tom Henley's wife and 3 nights of sitting in the dark with someone who was frightened, about 15 years of accounts and the careful, precise handwriting of a man who trusted people, and the moment that handwriting got shaky, and Eleanor noticing it and saying, "That makes me angry, not for the money for your father." He thought about laughing in his own kitchen for the first time in years. He stood up. He walked around the desk to where Eleanor was sitting, and he crouched down so he was at her level, and he looked at her directly. "I'm certain," he said. "The investigation made me say it tonight, but it didn't make it true. What made it true was you. 6 weeks of you every day, and I—" His jaw was tight. He made it relax. "I don't want the arrangement anymore. I want my wife." Eleanor looked at him for a very long time. Then she reached out and put her hand over his, where it rested on the arm of the chair. "Then that," she said quietly, "is what you have." Outside, the Wyoming wind drove hard against the house, and the fire settled low, and in the study of the Walker Ranch on a Saturday in November, something that had started as paperwork and survival became quietly and irrevocably something else entirely. Nathan stayed where he was, crouched beside her chair, and neither of them moved for a long moment. "The investigator comes Monday," Eleanor said finally. "I know. We should probably talk about what we're going to say." "We're going to tell the truth," Nathan said. She looked at him. "All of it," she said. He held her gaze. "All of it," he said. She nodded once. Then she picked up her pen and he pulled a chair to the other side of the desk, and they sat together in the firelight and built the case for their own marriage, not as a story to tell an investigator, but as the true accounting of what 6 weeks had actually been and what it had quietly, steadily become. And Tom Henley, passing the study window on his way to the bunkhouse and seeing the two of them bent over papers in the lamplight, paused for just a moment. He smiled to himself. Then he walked on. Robert Ames arrived at the Walker Ranch on Monday morning exactly when he said he would. Nathan respected that, in the abstract way he respected anyone who did what they said they were going to do. It didn't make the morning easier. Ames set his satchel on the kitchen table and accepted the coffee Eleanor offered without comment, and he looked around the kitchen with the careful, neutral expression of a man trained to notice things without reacting to them. Nathan watched him notice the account books stacked neatly on the side table, the winter herbs hanging from the ceiling beam, the 2 coffee cups already on the counter before he arrived, which meant this was a household where 2 people had breakfast together. "I'll speak with you separately," Ames said. "Standard procedure. Mr. Walker, if you don't mind waiting outside, I'll start with Mrs. Walker." Nathan looked at Eleanor. She met his eyes with that steady, direct gaze of hers, the one that said she had already thought through everything that was going to happen and had made her peace with it. "I'll be on the porch," Nathan said. He went outside and stood in the cold and did not think about what was being said in his kitchen. He thought about fence lines. He thought about feed inventory. He thought about absolutely nothing useful for about 40 minutes, while the wind came off the mountains and cut straight through his coat. Tom Henley came and stood beside him without being asked. Neither of them spoke. That was one of Tom's better qualities. When the kitchen door opened and Ames appeared, Nathan came off the porch railing and went inside. Eleanor was at the counter with her back to him, refilling the coffee pot. Her spine was straight. Her hands were steady. He couldn't see her face. "Mr. Walker," Ames said, and gestured to the chair across the table. Nathan sat. Ames opened his notebook. "I'm going to ask you some straightforward questions. I need straightforward answers." "That's fine." "When did you first meet your wife?" "Morning of the wedding," Nathan said. "She introduced herself on the street outside the dressmaker's shop." Ames made a note. "And you had no prior relationship?" "No." "The marriage was arranged by the town council?" "Gerald Holt suggested it. The council facilitated it." "Yes." "At the time of the wedding, was it your intention to enter into a genuine marital relationship? Or was the marriage primarily for the purpose of qualifying for federal assistance?" Nathan was quiet for exactly 1 beat. "At the time of the wedding," he said carefully. My primary concern was keeping my ranch. I won't lie about that. I was in a difficult position, and the program offered a solution, and Eleanor Hayes was willing to be part of that solution. He paused. That was 6 weeks ago. Ames looked up from his notebook. And now, he said. Nathan looked at the man across the table from him. Now, he said, my primary concern is my wife. Ames studied him. That's a significant change in 6 weeks. It is, Nathan agreed. Can you explain it? Nathan thought about everything he could say. The accounts, the letters, Billy's arm, Lena Gruber's children, the way Eleanor laughed when he'd said something unintentionally honest, the way she'd looked at him across that desk on Saturday night and said, "What I cannot survive is being chosen because the timing was convenient." She's the most capable person I've ever been in a room with, Nathan said. And the most decent. And I was too busy trying to keep my land to notice for the first 3 weeks, and then I noticed, and then I couldn't stop noticing. He met Ames's eyes. That's the honest version. Ames wrote something in his notebook. Then he closed it. Mr. Walker, he said, I've been doing this work for 11 years. I've interviewed a lot of couples who married for practical reasons, and I've interviewed a lot of couples who married for love. The ones who married for love are usually better at talking about it. He tucked the notebook into his satchel. The ones who married for practical reasons and then fell in love, they sound exactly like you. They sound slightly annoyed about it. From the counter, without turning around, Eleanor made a sound. It was small. It was controlled. But it was unmistakably a laugh. Ames stood and picked up his satchel. I'll file my report this week. I don't anticipate any findings that would affect the assistance program. He paused at the door. You might want to pass along to Gerald Hendricks when you speak with him next that filing a false complaint with a federal land office carries its own set of consequences. He left. The kitchen door closed. Nathan looked at Eleanor's back. You laughed, he said. She turned around. Her expression was composed, but her eyes were bright. I did not. You did. I expressed mild amusement at a professionally delivered observation. You laughed at me. Nathan. She set down the coffee pot. The man said you sound slightly annoyed about being in love with me. I heard what he said. And Nathan stood up from the table. And he said, he's not wrong. Eleanor looked at him for a moment. Then she smiled, the real one. The one he'd learned to wait for, the one that changed the whole quality of her face. No, she said. He's not. Oh, what happened next was the part no one in Red Willow Creek had anticipated. Ames filed his report. The complaint was dismissed. And 3 days later, the Territorial Land Office sent Gerald Hendricks a formal notice of investigation for fraudulent billing practices across 5 ranch operations in the valley. Gerald Hendricks had tried to use a federal investigator as a weapon, and the weapon had turned around. The news moved through Red Willow Creek the way news always moved, fast and with embellishments. By Friday, the story had acquired several details that weren't true, but the core of it was accurate enough. Nathan Walker's wife had uncovered 15 years of fraud. Gerald Hendricks had tried to retaliate by filing a false federal complaint, and the complaint had backfired so completely that Hendricks was now facing the investigation he'd been trying to avoid. Eleanor heard the version with the embellishments from Lena Gruber, who'd come back to thank her for the supply order and the lease conversation, which Hans Gruber had apparently come around to accepting after 2 days of private thinking. People are talking about you differently, Lena said. She was sitting at the kitchen table while Eleanor cut dried apple for the week's supply. Good differently or bad differently, Eleanor said. Mixed, Lena said honestly. Some people think you're very clever. Some people think you're dangerous. Patricia Voss told the women's circle that you have Nathan wrapped around your finger. Eleanor's knife paused for just a moment, then continued. What do you think? She said. Lena thought about it with the serious expression she brought to most things. I think you helped my family when you didn't have to. And I think Nathan Walker, who nobody in this town has seen smile in 3 years, smiles now. She paused. I don't think that's dangerous. I think it's the opposite of dangerous. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Thank you, Lena, she said. Lena went home. Eleanor finished the apples, and Nathan came in from the cold an hour later and found her still at the kitchen table, her hands folded, not doing anything. He had never seen her not doing anything. He stopped. Are you all right? She looked up. Lena says you smile now. He processed that. Lena should mind her business. Nathan, what? Do you... Eleanor looked at him directly. Are you genuinely... She stopped, and it was the first time he had ever seen her lose the thread of a sentence, and it undid something in him immediately. I want to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. I always answer honestly. I know, that's why I'm asking. She looked at her hands. Is this real, not for the investigation, not for the ranch, just for you? Is this real? Nathan crossed the kitchen. He sat down across from her, and he waited until she looked up at him. Yes, he said. She studied his face. Okay, she said quietly. Okay. Okay. She unfolded her hands and picked up where she'd stopped with the dried apple. I needed to hear you say it when nothing was at stake. Nathan watched her work for a moment. Eleanor. I'm going to need you to believe me eventually, without asking me to prove it. She looked up, and the expression on her face was complicated. Something between the careful composure she'd carried for years and something newer, something that was still learning how to exist in daylight. I know, she said. I'm working on it. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. She went very still. His hand stayed where it was. After a moment, she turned her hand over and let her fingers close around his, and neither of them said anything at all. And it was better than anything either of them could have said. Calvin Brooks made his move on the Thursday of the following week. Nathan should have expected it. Calvin was not a man who absorbed public defeats gracefully, and the collapse of Gerald Hendricks's complaint had been by extension a defeat for Calvin. He had been the one quietly amplifying Hendricks's version of events around town, had been the voice whispering that a woman like Eleanor couldn't possibly have legitimate motives, that the whole thing smelled like manipulation. He waited until the annual Red Willow Creek Founders' Day gathering, the one event in the year that drew everyone in the county, held in the church hall run by the Women's Circle, attended by people who hadn't spoken to each other since last year's version of the same event. Nathan had not planned to go. He avoided these gatherings the way he avoided most things that required him to be pleasant to people he didn't like. Eleanor said, "We should go." He looked at her. "People need to see us," she said. "Together, in public, not as a spectacle as ordinary people who live here." She paused. "If we avoid it, it looks like we have something to hide." She was right. She was frequently right. They went. The church hall was warm and crowded and loud in the particular way of events where people are pretending to enjoy themselves while actually watching everyone else. Nathan recognized most faces. He accepted handshakes from men who were friendlier to him now than they'd been 6 months ago, which told him something about how people responded to the perception of success. He watched Eleanor move through the room with the careful, contained grace she brought everywhere, accepting introductions, responding to questions, navigating the social waters of a community that had spent 8 years deciding what it thought of her. She was extraordinary at it. Not warm in the performed way, the way women were expected to be warm at these things. Just real, attentive. She remembered what people had told her about their families and asked after the right children by name. She listened when elderly men talked too long about cattle prices. She talked to the younger women who stood at the edges of the room, looking uncertain the way Eleanor must have stood at the edges of rooms for years. Nathan watched her from across the hall, talking to Reverend Crane's wife, and felt something he recognized as pride, and something else he recognized as the specific ache of a man who is only now understanding what was available to him. Then Calvin Brooks walked up to Eleanor. Nathan saw it happen. He was 20 feet away in conversation with Hans Gruber about the pasture lease terms, and he saw Calvin approach Eleanor from the side while she was momentarily standing alone, waiting for Reverend Crane's wife to return from across the room. He started moving. He was not quite close enough. "Mrs. Walker," Calvin said loud enough to carry. The people nearby went slightly quiet the way people go quiet when they sense entertainment. "I have to say you've had quite a few weeks." Eleanor turned to face him. Her expression was perfectly level. "Mr. Brooks," she said. "Federal investigators fraud claims Gerald Hendricks's troubles." Calvin shook his head with the expression of a man performing sympathy. "It does seem like a great deal of disruption follows in your wake, does it?" Eleanor said. "Well?" Calvin spread his hands. "You come to this town with nothing. You convince a desperate man to marry you with what I'm sure was a very compelling story. You immediately start going through 15 years of his financial records, and within a month, the whole valley's turned upside down." He smiled the smile that never reached his eyes. "Everyone knows why this marriage happened. A man needed a solution, and a woman nobody wanted needed a home. That's not love, Mrs. Walker. That's a transaction. And frankly, I think it's about time someone said it plainly." The room was quiet now, properly quiet. Nathan was 5 feet away. He opened his mouth. Eleanor spoke first. "Mr. Brooks." Her voice was quiet and completely steady. "You've been saying versions of that since the morning of my wedding. And every time you say it, I notice you're watching very carefully for my reaction." Calvin blinked. "I've been wondering why," Eleanor continued. "And I think I understand now. You need me to be what you've decided I am. An opportunist, a fraud, a woman who tricked her way into something she didn't deserve." She paused. "Because if I'm not those things, if the accounting I found was real, and the help I've given people was genuine, and the marriage you're mocking is actually what it looks like, then the story you've been telling about me for 8 years is just wrong, and men like you find it very difficult to be simply wrong." The room was silent. Calvin's face was red. "I don't need your approval," Eleanor said. "I don't need this town's approval. I stopped needing it a long time ago, and what I found when I stopped needing it was that I could actually be useful to people, which is more than I can say for—" Eleanor. Nathan was at her side. She stopped. He put his hand on her arm, not restraining, not managing. Just there, present. He looked at Calvin Brooks. "I think you're done here," Nathan said. Calvin looked at the two of them standing together and seemed to understand for the first time that he had miscalculated something significant. "This isn't over, Walker." "It is for tonight," Nathan said. Calvin left. The room exhaled. Nathan felt Eleanor's arm trembling slightly under his hand, not from fear he understood immediately. From the effort of holding all of that in, from the long practice of absorbing cruelty without flinching, which cost something even when you were good at it. He leaned slightly toward her. "Do you want to leave?" he said quietly. She took one breath, then another. "No," she said. "I want to stay." "Then we stay." She nodded. He kept his hand on her arm, and they stayed. And it was Tom Henley who told Nathan the rest of the story. Not that night Eleanor was quiet on the ride home, and Nathan let her be quiet because some things needed to settle before they could be spoken. But 2 days later, Tom came to find Nathan in the barn with the expression of a man who has been carrying something and has decided it's time to put it down. "There's something you should know," Tom said. "About Eleanor. About why the town is the way it is about her." Nathan set down his tools. "Tell me." Tom pulled up a stool. "Before Eleanor came to Red Willow Creek, he said she was engaged. Man named Thomas Reed, school teacher over in Laramie. Good man by all accounts. They were supposed to marry in the spring of '81. Nathan was still. "What happened?" "Accident. Early March, bad ice. Thomas Reed was crossing a bridge on his way to the schoolhouse and the ice gave way." Tom looked at his hands. "He didn't make it out." Nathan was quiet for a moment. She lost him, he said. She lost him. And she came apart some the way anyone would. Took a few months before she could work again. And in those few months... Tom stopped. The town where it happened decided she was unlucky. Cursed. Said the engagement had driven Thomas to be careless, that he'd been in a hurry to get back to her and moved too fast across that bridge. He shook his head. Foolishness. But it stuck. Nathan's jaw was tight. She came here to start over, Tom said. But word travels. Patricia Voss has a cousin in Laramie, and so Eleanor arrived in Red Willow Creek already carrying the reputation that the last man who chose her died for it. He looked up. That's why they called her what they called her, not just because she wasn't married, because they'd decided she was the reason she wasn't married, that something was wrong with her, not just different. Nathan stood up from the workbench. He paced 3 steps and stopped. She never told me, he said. She doesn't tell people, Tom said. She decided that fighting it made it bigger, so she just kept going, did her work, helped where she could. She lost the man she was going to marry, Nathan said, and instead of being given compassion for that, she was given a reputation. Yes. And she's carried that for 5 years. Yes. Nathan was silent for a long moment. Tom, he said. Yeah. The night Sarah was sick, the 3 nights Eleanor sat with her. He paused. Eleanor knew what it was to lose someone. Tom's face changed. It was subtle. A man in his late 50s who had seen most things didn't change his face easily. But something moved through it. I think she knew exactly what it was, Tom said quietly. I think that's why she stayed. Nathan left the barn. He went to the house, and he went to the study where Eleanor was, where she almost always was in the afternoons, working at something, managing something, being relentlessly useful in the way she was, because she had decided years ago that usefulness was the one thing no one could take away from her. She looked up when he came in. She read his face. She went still. In the way she went still when she knew something important was coming and was preparing to absorb it with the composure she'd spent years building. Tom told you, she said. Yes. She looked back at her papers. I should have told you myself. Yes, he said. You should have. She was quiet. Eleanor. He crossed the room and sat on the edge of the desk close enough that she had to look up at him. I'm not angry. I'm not... He stopped. Searched for the right words, which was always the hardest work. I wish you'd trusted me with it. I don't tell that story, she said. Her voice was controlled. Too controlled. I made a decision years ago that I wasn't going to spend my life being defined by the worst thing that happened to me. That's not the same as hiding it. Nathan, you can decide not to be defined by something and still let the people who love you know about it, he said. The word landed in the room. He hadn't planned to use it. He used it anyway. Eleanor stared at him. Nathan, she said. I know, he said. I know I said it. She was very still. Thomas was... She stopped, started again. He was kind. He was gentle. He laughed easily, which I always liked that in a person. A pause. When he died, I felt like the world had taken a very precise aim at the best thing that had happened to me. And... She stopped again. I know, Nathan said quietly. I came here because I thought I could build something new, and instead I found a town that had already decided what I was. She looked down at her hands. I got very good at not needing things from people, at being useful instead of vulnerable, because useful was safe and vulnerable was... She didn't finish. Dangerous, Nathan said. Yes. She looked up at him. And then I married you, and you were supposed to be safe too in a different way. Clear terms, defined arrangements, no room for anything that could be taken away. And then I complicated that, he said. You complicated that, she agreed. Something in her face was shifting. The careful composure she held so steadily was developing cracks, and the cracks were not weakness. They were openings, and what was showing through them was not damage, but the actual Eleanor, the one underneath the capable, contained indestructible presentation. "Eleanor," Nathan said. He reached out and put his hand against the side of her face, and she went completely still, like an animal that has been given kindness so rarely it doesn't quite know how to hold it. "I'm not Thomas," he said. "I can't be Thomas. But I'm here. And I'm not going anywhere. And I need you to understand that what I said the other night was not about the investigation and not about the ranch. It's about you." His thumb moved against her cheek. "Just you." Eleanor's eyes were bright. She did not cry. He hadn't expected her to. She was not a woman who cried easily, and even now she held it that long discipline of holding it. But the brightness was there, and the slight trembling in her jaw, and the way she exhaled very slowly. "You are," she said after a moment, "extremely inconvenient." "I know," he said. "I had a very workable system." "I'm aware. And you've completely—" "Eleanor." She stopped. He leaned forward and pressed his forehead against hers, and she closed her eyes, and they stayed like that for a moment in the quiet study with the accounts on the desk and the Wyoming wind outside, and the 5 years of her particular kind of alone settling into something different. "I know," she said finally, quietly. "I know you're here." And she leaned into him just slightly, just enough that he could feel it. That small, deliberate yielding of a woman who had held herself up for so long she'd forgotten what it felt like to let anyone else take some of the weight. Nathan put his arm around her and held on. Outside, the wind moved. The fire burned low. The account book sat untouched on the desk. And the woman this town had called unwanted, the woman who had buried a good man and been punished for grieving him, who had come to a new place to start over, and been handed an old reputation instead, who had married a stranger out of practicality and steadiness, and the careful logic of someone who had stopped trusting anything that felt like hope, rested against the shoulder of her husband, and let herself for the first time in 5 years feel completely safe. The morning after Eleanor let herself lean on Nathan's shoulder in the study, she woke up before dawn and lay still in the dark for a long time, staring at the ceiling of the room at the end of the hall. The lock was still on the door. She hadn't used it in 3 weeks. She thought about that. About what it meant that she had stopped thinking about it. About what it meant that the room she had been given as a guaranteed boundary had simply quietly, without announcement, stopped feeling like something she needed. She thought about Nathan's hand against her face, about his forehead pressed to hers, about the particular quality of being held by someone who didn't make you feel small for needing it. She thought about Thomas. She did this with the careful discipline she'd developed, took him out, looked at him, honestly, put him back. Thomas Reed had been a good man, a gentleman. She had loved him in the way of young people who believe that love is primarily a matter of finding the right person, and then everything else falls into place. She understood now that love was nothing like that. Love was a matter of showing up day after day in the actual circumstances of an actual life, and choosing the person in front of you over and over again. Not because they were perfect, not because the timing was good, because they were there and real. And the alternative, which was a life lived without choosing anyone, was something Eleanor Hayes had tried for 5 years and found in the end to be a very cold way to live. She got up. She made coffee. Nathan came downstairs at his usual time and stopped in the kitchen doorway when he saw she was already there. He looked at her with the morning expression she'd come to know, slightly guarded, slightly uncertain. The expression of a man who didn't quite trust that the good things that happened the night before would still be there in the daylight. She handed him a cup of coffee. He took it. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning," he said. They looked at each other for a moment, and something passed between them. Not words, not even a gesture, just the quiet acknowledgement of two people who had moved into new territory and were both cautiously deciding it was all right to be there. Then Tom knocked on the back door, and the day began, and they were both grateful for that, for the rhythm of work, that gave them somewhere to put themselves while the newer, more complicated things settled. Gerald Hendricks's formal investigation began the second week of December. The Territorial Land Office sent 2 additional men, and the process that followed was thorough and unhurried and extremely damaging to Gerald's position. The records Eleanor had organized, the ledgers, the delivery logs, the original contract language against which the inflated charges could be measured, made the investigators' work almost straightforward. 3 of the other affected ranchers came forward once it was clear the investigation was serious. They brought their own records, and those records confirmed the pattern Eleanor had identified, and the pattern was damning. Gerald Hendricks hired a lawyer from Cheyenne. The lawyer looked at the evidence and had what witnesses described as a very difficult meeting with his client. Nathan heard about this through Tom, who heard about it through Ruiz, who had it from a stable hand in town, who had been within earshot of the lawyer's exit from Gerald's office. "What did the lawyer say?" Nathan asked. Apparently, Tom said the word indefensible came up several times. Nathan thought about his father's careful handwriting going shaky in 1878. He thought about 15 years of money leaving this ranch through a hole that a sick man hadn't had the strength to find and close. "Good," he said. Tom looked at him. "Gerald's going to try to settle, pay back what he owes, avoid the formal charges. Word is, he's already talked to 3 of the ranchers privately. He hasn't talked to me." "No," Tom said. "I don't think he's ready to talk to you yet. He'll need to be," Nathan said. That afternoon, Nathan went to the study and found Eleanor at the desk. He sat down across from her and laid out what Tom had told him. Eleanor listened without interrupting, which was one of the things he'd learned to depend on her complete attention when something mattered. "He'll offer you a settlement number that's lower than the actual damages," she said when he finished. "I expect so. He'll frame it as generosity, avoiding the burden of a long legal process. Probably." "Don't take it," she said simply. Nathan raised an eyebrow. "The full amount might take years to recover in a formal case." "The full amount is what your father was owed," Eleanor said. "And what you were owed, and what the other ranchers were owed. If you settle low, Gerald Hendricks pays a fraction of what he stole, calls it resolved, and the next man he decides to exploit doesn't have the precedent to point to." She paused. "But that's your decision. I just want you to know what settling for less actually costs." Nathan looked at her for a moment. "You'd make a good lawyer," he said. "I'd make a terrifying lawyer," she said without any false modesty. "That's probably why I didn't pursue it." He smiled. She noticed. "You're doing that more," she said. "Tom says the same thing." Tom is observant. "Tom is insufferably pleased with himself about all of this," Nathan said. Eleanor smiled back. "He should be. He was right." Calvin Brooks came to the ranch on a Wednesday morning. He came alone, which was unusual for Calvin. He was a man who preferred audiences who operated best when there were witnesses to how important he was. The fact that he came alone told Nathan something before a word was spoken. Nathan met him on the porch. He did not invite him inside. "Nathan," Calvin said. He was wearing his good coat and his careful expression. "I'd like to speak with you." "So speak." Calvin glanced at the door where Eleanor had appeared, not hovering just present with the specific brand of composed attention she brought to things she considered her business. Nathan's ranch was her business. Nathan was her business. Calvin seemed to register her presence and recalibrate. "I've been thinking," Calvin said, "that things between us have gotten unnecessarily adversarial." "Have they?" Nathan said. "The situation with Gerald, that's a legal matter. It'll be sorted out through proper channels. I don't have a stake in that." Calvin paused. "What I do have a stake in is the well-being of this community, and I think it would be better for everyone if we could move past some of the tension." "You stood up at a public gathering," Nathan said, "and implied my wife manipulated her way into this marriage. You've been saying versions of that for months." Calvin's careful expression flickered. "I may have been too quick to—" "You have been wrong," Nathan said. Not too quick. Wrong. There's a difference, and I'd like you to say the right word. Calvin was quiet. I was wrong, he said finally. The words came out like they cost him something, which they did. Nathan looked at him for a long moment. Eleanor, he said. She came to stand beside him. Calvin looked at her, and it was the first time Nathan thought that Calvin Brooks had actually looked at her. Not at the idea of her, not at the reputation, not at the story he'd constructed, at the actual woman. Mrs. Walker, Calvin said, I owe you an apology. Eleanor regarded him with the expression she used when she was being careful. What changed your mind, Mr. Brooks? Calvin seemed surprised by the question. I beg your pardon. You've had the same information about me for months, the same facts. I'm the same person I was in October. She tilted her head slightly. What changed? Calvin opened his mouth, closed it. Gerald Hendricks is losing, she said. And you had aligned yourself with him publicly, privately, loudly. And now you'd like to be on the correct side before the official verdict makes it obvious which side that is. She paused. That's not an apology, Mr. Brooks. That's insurance. Calvin's face went through several expressions. Nathan said nothing. He was watching Eleanor, and what he felt watching her was something he recognized finally, without needing to name it cautiously or hold it at arm's length. He was proud of her. Not in the patronizing way. In the way of a man who has the extraordinary luck of standing next to someone exceptional and knowing it. You're right, Calvin said. And this time it sounded different, flatter, less performed. You're right. I came here because it's useful to me. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. Eleanor looked at him for a moment. At least that's honest, she said. For what it's worth. Calvin said. I've spoken to people this week who told me things about you I didn't know. The Grubers, the Marsh Boy, Margaret Crane. A pause. Tom Henley's wife asked me once before she died whether I'd ever actually spoken to you. I told her I knew your reputation. He looked at his hat in his hands. She said that was the problem with most people in this town. The porch was quiet. Sarah Henley, Nathan thought. Even after death, still right about everything. I accept your apology, Eleanor said. The one underneath the insurance. Calvin looked up. Something almost like respect moved across his face. You're not easy to deal with, Mrs. Walker. No, she agreed. I'm not. He left. Nathan and Eleanor stood on the porch and watched his horse disappear down the lane. Do you believe him? Nathan said. Eleanor considered it seriously. I believe he's uncomfortable. I believe he's reconsidering. Whether he's actually changed. She shrugged once, the small, economical shrug she used for things that were beyond her control. Time will tell. You were harder on him than I expected, Nathan said. She looked at him. Were you expecting me to make it easy for him? No, he said after a moment. I suppose I wasn't. Good, she said. She went back inside. Nathan stayed on the porch for a moment, looking at the lane, and thought about what it meant to stand next to a woman who knew precisely what she was worth, and didn't negotiate it down for anyone's comfort. He thought he could spend a long time learning from that. The twist that Nathan hadn't anticipated arrived in a letter. It came on a Thursday, addressed to Eleanor, from a law office in Laramie. Eleanor opened it at the kitchen table, while Nathan was sitting across from her with his morning coffee, and he watched her read it, and he watched her face do something unusual, go blank in the way that meant she was receiving information that was reorganizing things significantly. She set the letter on the table. Thomas Reed had a brother, she said. Nathan set down his coffee. You didn't know. Thomas didn't speak of him. They were estranged, something that happened before I met Thomas. Something he was ashamed of. He never told me the details. She looked at the letter. His name is Martin Reed. He's a lawyer in Laramie. What does he want? Eleanor was quiet for a moment. When Thomas died, he left a small estate. A house, some savings, some personal effects. Martin was the closest living relative, so Martin inherited. She paused. But Thomas had made a written declaration of intent to marry me. According to Martin Reed's lawyer, that declaration creates a potential legal claim on part of the estate, specifically a portion that Thomas had explicitly designated in writing for the establishment of a household with his intended wife. Nathan looked at the letter. How much funds? $400 and the house. Eleanor looked up. Martin Reed is contesting the claim. He says the declaration was never formalized into a legal instrument, and since the marriage never took place, I have no standing. Do you? Nathan said carefully. I don't know. She folded the letter. I never pursued it. After Thomas died, I left. I didn't think about the estate. I didn't want his money. I wanted... She stopped. You wanted him, Nathan said. Yes. Her voice was steady. I wanted him. Nathan was quiet for a moment. But the letter is coming now, he said. 5 years later. Martin Reed has apparently recently discovered that I've married, and have, as his lawyer puts it, established financial stability through my current household. She looked at Nathan. He's worried I'm going to file a claim against the estate. Are you? Eleanor looked at him directly. No, I have no intention of filing any claim. I don't want Martin Reed's money, and I don't want that house, and I don't want anything to do with a 5-year-old legal argument about a man I loved who is gone. She paused. But Martin Reed doesn't know that. So he's preemptively attacking. He sent a legal notice suggesting that any claim I might file would be contested vigorously, and implying that he has information about the circumstances of Thomas's death that would complicate my position. She said these last words very carefully. Nathan felt something cold move through him. What kind of information? Eleanor set the letter down flat on the table. The bridge, she said. The bridge where Thomas died. Martin Reed apparently intends to argue that Thomas was crossing it in bad conditions because he was hurrying to meet me, that I had sent him a letter asking him to come early, and that letter influenced the decision that killed him. The kitchen was completely silent. Eleanor, Nathan said. I did send him a letter, she said. Her voice was very controlled. Too controlled. I asked him to come 3 days early because I had finished making the curtains for our house and I wanted him to see them. I was excited. I was 26 years old and I was marrying a man I loved, and I was excited about curtains. She stopped, swallowed. He came early. He crossed a bridge in bad conditions. He died. That is not your fault, Nathan said. I know that, she said. I have known that for 5 years. I have worked very hard to know that. Her jaw was tight. But Martin Reed intends to stand up in front of a court and make a case for it. And even if the case fails, the story travels. It will follow me. She looked at Nathan. It will follow us. Nathan looked at her, at the letter, at her hands which were flat on the table and completely deliberately still. Does Martin Reed know you've married a man who spent 15 years building a legal fraud case against a supply company and winning? He said. Eleanor blinked. No, she said. I don't think he does. Does Martin Reed know that you've spent the past 3 months building relationships with every significant family in this county, and that the Territorial Land Office now has personal experience of your organizational competence and your honesty? She was watching him. Probably not, she said. Does Martin Reed know? Nathan said that his letter arrived at the wrong ranch. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then she said, What do you want to do? Nathan picked up the letter. He read it through carefully, the way he read anything that had legal implications, slowly and without assumption. I want to write back, he said. I want to write back and tell Martin Reed that you have no intention of filing any claim on his brother's estate, that you never had any such intention, and that if he files any legal action against you based on the circumstances of Thomas Reed's death, he will be contesting not just you, but the full resources of the Walker Ranch and the testimony of every family in Red Willow Creek and surrounding counties who can speak to your character. He set the letter down. And then I want to ask Tom to find out who Martin Reed's biggest clients are, because lawyers with clients have things to lose. Eleanor stared at him. "Nathan," she said. "You're my wife," he said. It came out very simply, very flat, the way he said things he considered facts. "Someone is trying to hurt you with the worst thing that ever happened to you. I'm not interested in standing aside and watching that happen." Her eyes were bright again. She pressed her lips together for a moment. "You are," she said very quietly, "not what I expected when I walked into that church." "What did you expect?" "A transaction," she said. He held her gaze. "And what did you get?" Eleanor looked at him for a long, searching moment. "A partner," she said. It was the word he hadn't known he'd been waiting for. The letter Nathan wrote to Martin Reed's legal office was 3 paragraphs long. Eleanor wrote the first draft. Nathan read it, made 2 changes, and signed it. The response came back in 10 days. Martin Reed's lawyer indicated that his client had reconsidered his position and wished to clarify that the notice had been sent in error and that no legal action was intended or anticipated. Eleanor read the letter at breakfast. She folded it neatly. She put it in the bottom of the document box where she kept the important papers, and then she went back to her eggs. Nathan watched her. "That's it," he said. "That's it," she said. 5 years, he said. 5 years of carrying that, and it doesn't go away," she said quietly. "Martin Reed backing down doesn't change what happened. It doesn't change the bridge or the letter about the curtains or any of it." She looked at him. "But it means he can't use it against me, and that matters." "It matters a lot," Nathan said. She nodded. She ate her eggs. Nathan ate his. After a moment, Eleanor said, "I'd like to plant something in the spring, in the south yard. Flowers, maybe. Something that isn't useful for anything except being there." Nathan looked up. In 3 months of living with this woman, he had never once heard her propose something that wasn't useful. "All right," he said carefully. "Thomas would have liked that," she said. "And it wasn't sad, or not only sad. It was the way you said the name of someone gone, when you finally found the place where their memory lives at peace." He liked things that were just beautiful. No other purpose. Nathan was quiet for a moment. "What kind of flowers?" he said. "Wild roses, maybe." She thought about it. "And columbine. They grow well at altitude." "I'll get seeds in town," he said. She looked at him. "You don't have to, Eleanor," he said. "I'll get seeds in town." She was quiet. Then, "Thank you." "It's flowers," he said. "Don't make it into more than it is." She smiled, the real one, quick and warm. "Of course," she said. "Just flowers." Gerald Hendricks's formal settlement came through on the 15th of December. He paid the full amount. Not because he wanted to. Because the investigators had finished their work and the number they arrived at left Gerald no room to negotiate. And because 3 of the other affected ranchers, emboldened by the precedent Nathan had set in, refusing the early lowball offer, had held firm as well. And because the alternative was formal criminal charges that Gerald Hendricks's Cheyenne lawyer had made very clear were not theoretical. The settlement covered 15 years of inflated billing. When the bank draft arrived at the Walker Ranch, Nathan held it for a moment and thought about his father. About careful handwriting going shaky. About a good man who trusted people and got taken while he was too sick to see it. He went and found Eleanor. She was in the kitchen teaching Billy Marsh the 2nd level of account reading, the part where you tracked expenses against revenue and looked for the places they didn't line up. Billy was taking notes with his good arm, his expression, the focused one he wore when he was working hard at something. "Billy," Nathan said, "give us a minute." Billy took his notes and went. Nathan put the bank draft on the table. Eleanor looked at it. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "Your father would be glad." "Yes," Nathan said. "He would." She looked up at him. "What are you going to do with it?" "Pay down the remaining loan. Repair the north fence line, it's been needing it for 2 years. Buy the 2 breeding horses I've been looking at in Cheyenne." He paused. "And order seeds." Eleanor's expression softened. Wild roses, she said. And columbine, he said. You said they grow well at altitude. She looked at him for a long moment. Nathan Walker, she said quietly. Eleanor Walker, he said. Her chin came up slightly the way it had in that church, that gesture that meant she was absorbing something important and deciding not to let it knock her sideways. This ranch is going to be all right, she said. It is, he agreed. Because of what you built, she said. What your father built. Because of what we built, he said. These last 3 months. She didn't argue with that. She looked at the bank draft one more time and then back at him. There's something I'd like to do, she said. What? The Gruber family. The pasture lease is helping, but Hans lost 2 animals in the early cold snap, and they're going to be short by spring. She paused. I'd like to give them something from the settlement. Not a loan, a gift. Nathan looked at her. How much? He said. She named a number. It was careful, large enough to matter, small enough not to be charity in the way that stung a proud man's dignity. Done, Nathan said. She blinked. Just like that. You've thought about it more carefully than I have, he said. If you say that number is right, it's right. Eleanor looked at him with the expression she got sometimes when he said something that surprised her, like she was still 3 months in, recalibrating what kind of man he was. Thank you, she said. Stop thanking me, he said. You'd do it yourself if the money were yours. Half of it is mine, she pointed out. Then you don't need to thank me at all, he said. She laughed. He loved that sound. He had never told her he loved that sound. He had never told her any of the specific things, the exact textures of what he felt when she laughed or read or argued or looked at him across the kitchen table in the morning with that direct, unguarded expression she wore before the day's composure settled in. He hadn't found the words yet, but he was thinking about finding them. The last week of December brought snow. The kind of Wyoming snow that settled in deep and stayed, not the dramatic early-season storms that came fast and left, but the quiet, steady accumulation that meant winter was serious and intended to hold its position. The ranch closed in. The work narrowed to the essential feeding, watering, checking on the animals, keeping the paths clear. The days were short and the nights were long, and the household settled into the particular closeness that winter creates, whether you intend it or not. Nathan and Eleanor spent those evenings in the kitchen or the study, and the evenings had become something he looked forward to, with the kind of simple, uncomplicated anticipation that he hadn't felt about anything in years. They talked. They argued occasionally about the best approach to the spring planting schedule, about a boundary dispute with a neighboring property that Eleanor thought should be handled differently than Nathan planned, about whether Billy Marsh was ready to take on more responsibility or needed another season of supervised work. Eleanor was almost always right in these arguments. Nathan had started telling her so directly because she noticed when he conceded ground grudgingly and seemed faintly amused by it, and he'd rather she know he meant it. One evening close to Christmas, they were sitting by the fire after dinner, and Eleanor was reading something she read constantly in the gaps between everything else, books borrowed from Reverend Crane's small library and newspapers that arrived from Cheyenne a week late, and Nathan was working on a harness repair, and the quiet between them was the kind of quiet that has settled into something genuinely comfortable, nothing needing to be filled. Billy knocked on the kitchen door at about 8 o'clock, which was unusual. Nathan called him in. Billy came to the doorway with his hat in his hands and the expression of a young man who has something to say that he's not sure how to say. "Sorry to bother you," he said. "There's something you should both know." Nathan set down the harness. Eleanor set down her book. "Ruiz went into town today for the supply run," Billy said. "He heard something at the general store. Frank Dooley was talking." "Frank Dooley is always talking," Nathan said. This time it was about Mrs. Walker. Billy looked at Eleanor directly. "Someone sent a letter to the Women's Circle, anonymous, about a man in Laramie who died, about the bridge, about a letter Mrs. Walker wrote." He stopped. "Frank said Patricia Voss read it at the Circle meeting this afternoon." The fire made its sounds. Eleanor was very still. Nathan looked at her face. "Martin Reed," she said quietly. "Probably," Nathan said. His voice was level. He was working to keep it level. He said he wasn't going to take any action. He didn't take legal action, Nathan said. This isn't legal action. Billy looked between them. I'm sorry, Mrs. Walker. I thought you should know before town. Before the story travels, Eleanor said. Yes. She looked at her hands for a moment. Thank you, Billy. That was the right thing to do. Billy nodded, relieved to have done the right thing, and left. Nathan sat quietly for a moment. Eleanor was looking at the fire. He waited until the settlement came through, she said. Until it was public that the ranch was financially sound. He wanted people to think that She stopped. That you married me for money, Nathan said. And that you've been dangerous to the men in your life. Yes. Nathan set down the harness completely and put his hands on his knees. All right, he said. She looked at him. All right. He wants a fight in the public square, Nathan said. He's chosen one. Eleanor studied him. Nathan, I don't want you to. Eleanor. He looked at her with the expression she had learned meant he had made a decision and was not reconsidering it. You spent 5 years in this town with your chin up and your hands working and your heart open, and you did that alone. You don't have to do it alone anymore. Her throat moved. What are you going to do? She said. I'm going to go into town tomorrow, he said. And I'm going to collect letters from the Grubers, from Billy, from Reverend Crane and his wife, from every family you've helped since you walked into this county. He paused. And then I'm going to ask Tom Henley to come with me because Tom Henley has been in this community for 20 years and people listen to Tom. And we're going to walk into wherever Patricia Voss and her circle are gathered, and we're going to talk about who Eleanor Walker actually is. Eleanor was looking at him. You'd do that, she said, not a question. I'd do considerably more than that, he said. She was quiet for a long moment. The fire burned. Nathan, she said. Eleanor, I need to tell you something. She folded her hands carefully in her lap. I have been telling myself since October that I was keeping this what was growing between us at arm's length because I was being sensible. Because I didn't want to confuse practicality with something else. Because I'd made that mistake before, and it cost me everything. She looked at him steadily. I've been lying to myself. Nathan held her gaze. I know, he said quietly. I'm not keeping it at arm's length anymore, she said. I want you to know that. Whatever happens tomorrow, whatever Martin Reed has done with that letter, and whatever this town decides to do with the story, I'm not keeping it at arm's length. Nathan stood up. He crossed to where she was sitting. He held out his hand. She looked at it. Then she put her hand in his and stood, and he held on to it and looked at her. This woman who had walked into his church with her chin up and her eyes forward and her dignity intact after everything the world had done with it. We'll go together tomorrow, he said. Together, she agreed. He kept her hand. She let him. And outside, the snow fell steadily over the Walker Ranch, covering everything in white and clean and quiet. And inside, 2 people, who had started as strangers, and a signature, stood together in the firelight, and faced what was coming, and neither of them was afraid. They rode into Red Willow Creek the next morning before 8 o'clock. The snow from the night before had settled hard, and the cold was the kind that got into your coat and stayed. But Nathan drove the wagon at his usual pace, and Eleanor sat beside him, with her hands folded in her lap, and her chin at the angle he had come to recognize as her preparing for something difficult. Tom Henley rode alongside on his gray mare. He had shown up at the barn at 6:30 without being asked, already saddled, already carrying the particular expression of a man who has decided that today is a day worth showing up for. You don't have to come, Nathan had told him. Tom had looked at him with a 20-year stare. I was there when Sarah was sick, he said. I know who sat with her. I've been waiting for the right moment to say so publicly for 3 months. He turned his horse toward the lane. Let's go. They didn't speak much on the ride in. The kind of silence between people who have already said what needs saying and are now simply moving toward what comes next. Eleanor watched the valley pass on either side and thought about Patricia Voss reading that letter to the women's circle. Thought about the particular pleasure certain people took in other people's worst moments. Not cruelty, exactly, more like hunger, the hunger of people whose own lives felt small, who needed the drama of other lives to make them feel large. She had spent 8 years letting that hunger feed on her without fighting back. Today was different. She knew it was different because Nathan was beside her on the wagon seat, and Tom Henley was on their left, and in the inside pocket of Nathan's coat were 7 letters. She had helped him write them the night before, after Billy had gone back to the bunkhouse, and the fire had burned low, and they had sat at the kitchen table together and worked through every family, every person, every moment of the last 3 months that could be put into words and signed. 7 letters. Hans and Lena Gruber, Billy Marsh, Reverend Aldous Crane and his wife Margaret, Dr. Fielding, who had confirmed the quality of her work on Billy's arm. A widow named Clara Hatch, 60 years old, who Eleanor had helped through a property dispute with a neighboring landowner 2 months ago, quietly without fanfare at no charge. And Tom Henley himself, whose letter was the longest, and whose handwriting was the most careful, and who had given it to Nathan that morning, folded precisely in thirds. 7 letters. Martin Reed had sent 1 anonymous note. Eleanor thought about that. Then, Patricia Voss was in the general store. This was not surprising. Patricia Voss was always in the general store, or the post office, or wherever information moved fastest. She was a woman in her middle 50s who had never been deliberately cruel in her life, Eleanor thought, and had never once examined whether the things she passed along might function as cruelty regardless of intention. She was talking to Frank Dooley when Nathan pushed open the door. She looked up. She looked at Eleanor. She looked at Tom Henley. Her expression did the thing that people's expressions did when they realize a conversation they thought they'd had privately has reached its subject. A quick rearrangement, something between guilt and defensiveness, and the particular embarrassment of someone caught not at wrongdoing, but at something they can't quite call right either. "Nathan," Frank said with false cheer. "Cold morning." "Frank," Nathan said. He looked at Patricia. "Mrs. Voss." "Mr. Walker," she said. Her eyes moved to Eleanor. "Mrs. Walker." "I understand you had a meeting yesterday," Nathan said. He said it the way he said most things, plainly, without decoration, without anger. Just the fact of it laid down. Patricia's chin came up slightly. "The women's circle meets every Thursday." "And someone sent a letter," Nathan said, "about my wife." The store was quiet. Frank was not even pretending to do something else. "A letter was received, yes," Patricia said carefully. "Anonymous," Eleanor said. Patricia looked at her. "Yes." "Do you still have it?" Nathan asked. A pause. Yes. I have it at home." "I'd like it," Nathan said. "When we're done here." Patricia blinked. "I don't see what—" "The letter contains false claims about Eleanor's role in the death of a man in Laramie 5 years ago," Nathan said. "It was sent by a man named Martin Reed, who is Thomas Reed's brother, as retaliation for Eleanor refusing to file a legal claim against his brother's estate. The Territorial Land Office is already familiar with Mr. Reed's methods given his connection to Gerald Hendricks." He paused to let that land. Receiving and circulating a letter of that nature without verifying its claims puts the people who circulated it in a difficult legal position. That last part was not entirely accurate. But it was not entirely inaccurate either, and Nathan had said it with enough certainty that Patricia Voss's face went through 4 distinct expressions in about 2 seconds. "I didn't know it was false," she said. "I know you didn't," Eleanor said. And her voice was. Nathan noticed this, not angry. It was something more complicated than angry. "You received a letter that told a story about me that fit the story you already believed, and you shared it because it seemed credible. I understand that, Mrs. Voss. I'm not here to punish you for it." Patricia stared at her. "Then what are you here for?" she said, and her voice had gone slightly uncertain. the voice of a woman who had prepared for a confrontation and received something she didn't know how to handle. "I'm here," Eleanor said, "because I've lived in this town for 8 years, and this town doesn't know me, and I think it's time it did." Nathan reached into his coat and laid the 7 letters on the counter. Tom Henley read his own letter aloud. This had not been planned. Nathan had simply put the letters on the counter, and Tom had reached over and picked up the one with his own name on it, and unfolded it and begun to read without asking permission, with the authority of a man in his late 50s who has earned the right to do things without asking permission. His voice in the quiet store was unhurried and completely steady. He read about Sarah, about the fever in the spring, and the 3 nights, and the woman who sat in the dark with his wife without being asked, and without wanting anything for it. He read about Eleanor explaining that she understood what it was to lose someone you loved, and not wanting Sarah to be frightened. He read about the morning Sarah died, and the way Eleanor had been the one to make the tea, and the way she had stayed until Tom was ready to be alone, and then left quietly so he could be alone. When he finished, the store was completely silent. Frank Dooley was not pretending to do anything. Patricia Voss was looking at Eleanor with an expression that was doing something new and honest across her face. "I didn't know about Sarah," she said quietly. "I didn't know you were there. She asked me not to tell people," Tom said. He folded the letter with the same care he'd used to unfold it. Said she didn't want credit for it. He looked at Patricia directly. "That's the woman you've been talking about, Mrs. Voss. The one in that letter. That's who she is." Patricia pressed her lips together. Nathan picked up the other 6 letters and put them on the counter one at a time. "Hans Gruber," he said. "Billy Marsh, Reverend Crane, Dr. Fielding, Clara Hatch." He set the last one down. "And my own account, which I'll give you verbally since I was there for all of it." He talked for about 4 minutes. He talked about the account books and the 15 years of fraud that Eleanor found in 3 days. About the letter to the land office that had started the investigation that ended in a full settlement for 5 ranches. About Billy's arm and the doctor's assessment. About Lena Gruber's children. About the seed order for columbine and wild roses in memory of a man Eleanor had loved and never stopped honoring. He talked about a woman who walked into a church full of people who came to watch her fail and held her head up and kept it up for 3 months, while those same people circulated rumors and anonymous letters about her. When he stopped, the silence in the store was different from the silence at the beginning. Patricia Voss had her hand over her mouth. Frank Dooley was looking at the counter. "The letter," Nathan said. "When you get home, Mrs. Voss." "Yes," she said. Her voice was not quite steady. "Yes, of course." The women's circle met again on Saturday. Eleanor knew about it because Lena Gruber came to tell her Lena had been invited to join the circle 3 months ago and had been attending quietly, keeping Eleanor informed in the way of a friend who understands that information is a form of protection. "Patricia wants to see you," Lena said. "She asked me to ask you. I think she wants to fix something." Eleanor thought about it for about 10 seconds. "All right," she said. She went alone. Nathan offered to come. She told him no, and he accepted that without argument, which she noted with the part of her mind that was always still slightly surprised when he trusted her judgment without needing to manage it. The circle met in the back room of the church hall, 9 women of various ages, all of whom looked up when Eleanor came through the door with expressions ranging from curious to sheepish, to one woman in the back who looked openly relieved, as though Eleanor's presence resolved something she'd been uncomfortable about all week. Patricia Voss was standing at the front of the room. She looked, Eleanor thought, like a woman who had spent the last 2 days sitting with something she'd done and arriving at a conclusion she wasn't comfortable with but couldn't escape. "Mrs. Walker," she said, "thank you for coming." "You asked," Eleanor said. "I came." Patricia glanced at the other women and then looked back at Eleanor with the particular focus of someone who has decided to do something difficult and is not going to let anything distract her from doing it. "I want to apologize," she said. "Not the kind of apology where I explain why I did what I did, and the explanation takes so long that the apology gets lost in it." A pause. I shared that letter without knowing whether it was true. I shared it because it fit what I already thought about you, and that's exactly backwards from how a person should behave. I've been telling stories about you for 8 years based on nothing but other stories, and—" She stopped. "I was wrong. I'm sorry." The room was quiet. Eleanor looked at Patricia Voss, at this woman who had been the engine of 8 years of whispered judgment, and felt something she hadn't expected to feel. Not forgiveness exactly. Forgiveness would come later in its own time, the way it always did, gradually, without announcement. But something adjacent to it. Something that recognized that Patricia Voss had looked at herself honestly, and had not liked what she saw, and was now in front of witnesses saying so. That took something. "Thank you," Eleanor said. Patricia exhaled. "I'd like to ask you something," Eleanor said. "If that's all right?" "Of course." "Why did you decide I was what you decided I was?" Eleanor looked around the room at all of them, not just Patricia. "Not specifically. Generally. A woman comes to this town alone. She manages her own affairs. She doesn't attach herself to the right families or the right conversations. Why does that become a character flaw?" The room was quiet for a long moment. Then a woman in the second row, young, maybe 25, who Eleanor had seen at the Founders' Day gathering but never spoken to, said, "Because it made us feel like something was wrong with you. And if something was wrong with you, we didn't have to feel bad about not helping you." Several heads turned toward the young woman. Her name was Alice. Eleanor would learn later. Alice Marsh, Billy's older sister, who had moved to Red Willow Creek with her husband the previous spring. Alice looked slightly alarmed by her own honesty. Then she kept going. "If you were difficult, we didn't have to feel bad about leaving you on your own. If there was something wrong with you, it was your fault. You were alone, not ours." She paused. "But there wasn't anything wrong with you. And I think most of us knew that, and it was easier not to look at it directly." The silence that followed was the kind that happens when something true is said in a room full of people who needed to hear it. Patricia Voss looked like she had swallowed something difficult and was deciding it was medicine. Eleanor looked at Alice Marsh and thought, "Your brother is going to be fine on this ranch." Any woman who can say that at 25 in a room full of her elders is going to raise people who are fine. "All right," Eleanor said. "Then we know where we are, and we can decide where to go from here." She came home that evening to find Nathan on the porch. He was sitting on the top step in the cold, which was not his habit, and he looked up when the wagon came down the lane with the expression he always had when she'd been away for more than a few hours, the slight tension across his shoulders that released when he saw her. She had noticed that 3 weeks ago and had held it carefully to herself, the way you hold something delicate, the way you hold something you don't want to break by touching it too directly. "How was it?" he said. She climbed down from the wagon and tied the horse and came to the porch and sat beside him on the step. "Patricia Voss apologized," she said. "A real one." He looked at her. And a young woman named Alice Marsh said something very honest in front of 9 people, which I suspect cost her something. She paused. "It went better than I expected." Nathan was quiet for a moment. "Are you all right?" he said. She thought about it honestly, the way she tried to think about most things. "I've been not all right about this town for 8 years, she said. "And today I don't know if I'm all right exactly, but I think something shifted, something that had been the same for a long time." She looked out at the lane. "It doesn't undo what was said. It doesn't undo the years of it, but it's different now." "Different is better than the same," Nathan said. "Yes." She looked at him. "It is." He reached over without looking at her and put his hand over hers where it rested on the step between them. She turned her hand and held on. They sat in the cold together on the porch steps until the dark came fully down, and neither of them needed to say anything at all, and it was the most complete quiet Eleanor Hayes had felt in 5 years. The twist that Christmas brought was not what Nathan had been bracing for. He had been bracing quietly, without admitting it, for Martin Reed to try something else, for Calvin Brooks to regroup, for Gerald Hendricks' lawyer to find some new angle. He had been living at a low level of readiness since October, the posture of a man who has learned that when things start going well, something is usually coming. What came instead was a letter from his own lawyer in Cheyenne. He opened it on Christmas morning because the mail had been delayed by snow and arrived in a bundle that morning, and he read it at the kitchen table while Eleanor was making something that smelled like cinnamon and vanilla. And he read it twice to make sure he was understanding it correctly. "Eleanor," he said. She came to the doorway with a dish towel in her hands and read his face. "What is it?" "My father," he said. "When he filed the original property deeds, the homestead patents, the water rights, all of it, he filed a secondary document, a clause in the water rights agreement." He looked up. "It specifies that in the event the Walker property is ever found to have been subjected to commercial fraud that affected its financial standing, the property gains priority access to federal land consolidation credits." Eleanor stared at him. "He built a protection into the deed," she said slowly. "He did. My lawyer says the Hendricks settlement triggers the clause. It means—" Nathan stopped for a moment because the weight of it was larger than he'd expected. "It means the ranch qualifies for a land consolidation credit that would allow us to purchase the 40-acre parcel on the North Ridge that's been disputed with the Hartley brothers since my father's time." He set the letter down. "The land they've been blocking our water access through for 15 years. Eleanor sat down across from him. "Your father planned for this," she said. "He planned for something like this. He didn't know what form it would take. But he built a door and he left it there. And it's been waiting 20 years for someone to find the right key." Nathan looked at the letter. Eleanor found the fraud. The fraud triggered the clause. The clause solves the water problem that's been limiting this ranch's growth since before I took it over. The kitchen was quiet, except for the fire and the particular silence of something clicking into place after a very long time. "Your father," Eleanor said softly. "He was trying to protect you." "He was trying to protect the ranch," Nathan said. "From things he couldn't predict. He just built the protection into the right place and trusted that someone would eventually find it." He looked at her. "You found it. Without you finding the fraud, this clause sits in a document box forever." Eleanor was looking at the letter with an expression he couldn't entirely read. "He built a careful thing," she said. "And then he got sick, and Hendricks found the gap in the carefulness, and—" She stopped. But the foundation was still there. Everything he built carefully, it was still there under the damage. "Yes," Nathan said. She looked up at him. "That's what good things are. The ones people build with real care. Even when they get damaged, the foundation holds." Nathan looked at her across the kitchen table on Christmas morning. He thought about the foundation of this marriage, the morning in the street, the quiet promise at the altar, the account books and the 7 letters and the porch steps in the cold. He thought about the things that had been built carefully between them, and the things that had been damaged, and the things that had held anyway. "I need to tell you something," he said. Eleanor looked at him steadily. "I've been working up to saying it for about 6 weeks," he said. "And I keep finding reasons it's not the right moment. Too much is happening. Too complicated. She already knows she doesn't need to hear me say it." He paused. "All of those reasons are wrong." Eleanor was very still. "I love you," Nathan said. He said it the way he said important things, flatly, directly, without ornamentation, in a voice that made clear he had thought about it carefully and arrived at it honestly and was not going to be talked out of it. "I'm not saying it because it's Christmas," he said. "I'm not saying it because of the letter or the deed clause or because things are going well. I'm saying it because it's been true for long enough that not saying it has started to feel like a lie, and I don't lie to you." Eleanor's eyes were bright. She pressed her lips together for one moment. Then she said, "I know you don't." "Eleanor." "I love you too," she said. "I've known it for about 4 weeks, and I've been equally bad at saying it for exactly the same reasons." A pause. "We are," she said, "very similar people in some ways that I didn't expect." Nathan looked at her. "Come here," he said. She came around the table, and he stood, and she was in his arms, and he held her, with the straightforward, uncomplicated grip of a man who has found something worth holding and is not planning to let go. And she put her face against his shoulder, and for a moment she just breathed. They stayed like that for a long time. From the bunkhouse distantly, they could hear Billy Marsh singing something badly in a cheerful approximation of a Christmas carol, and Tom Henley's voice telling him to stop, and Billy not stopping. Eleanor laughed into his shoulder. He tightened his arms. The hearing for the North Ridge land consolidation was held in January on a Thursday morning in the same courthouse where Nathan had signed the assistance program paperwork 4 months earlier. The Hartley brothers attended with their own lawyer. Nathan and Eleanor sat across the room from them with their lawyer and a document box that Eleanor had organized with the same methodical precision she brought to everything. The Hartley brothers' lawyer was confident in the opening. He had 15 years of arguments prepared, all the established positions about the water rights dispute and the contested boundary, and the reasons the 40 acres should remain in Hartley hands. Eleanor had prepared Nathan's lawyer with 6 hours of counter-documentation spread over 3 evenings. When the Hartley lawyer finished his opening, Nathan's lawyer stood and presented the deed clause. The Hartley lawyer read it. He read it again. He asked for a 20-minute recess. He came back and asked for the proceeding to be tabled for 2 weeks for additional research. The judge, a brisk woman named Honorable Clara Finch, who had been on the bench in this county for 11 years, looked at the request with the expression of someone who has seen this exact maneuver many times. "Counselor," she said, "the clause is a primary document. It's not ambiguous. I've read it." She looked at her papers. The Walker property qualifies for the land consolidation credit under the terms of the original homestead patent. The North Ridge parcel is included in the credit scope. She set the papers down. Ruling in favor of the Walker property. The boundary transfer will be processed within 30 days. The Hartley lawyer looked at Nathan. Nathan looked at the wall behind the judge. He was thinking about his father's careful handwriting in the early years of the ledgers. He was thinking about a man who built things to last and buried protections inside them for people he wouldn't live to know. The hearing was over in 40 minutes. In the hallway of the courthouse, Eleanor put the document box under her arm and looked at Nathan. "The water problem is solved," she said. "Yes." "The north fence line can be extended by spring." "Yes." "The breeding horses you were looking at in Cheyenne with proper water access through the North Ridge, you can expand the pasture to support 12 more animals." Nathan looked at her. "We can expand the pasture," he said. She looked at him. "We," she repeated, testing it. "We," he said. Not as a correction, as a statement of the way things were. Eleanor shifted the document box under her arm and looked up at him with the expression he loved most. The one that had nothing performed in it, just Eleanor clear-eyed and real, and slightly wondering, as if she was still even now, not entirely used to being this happy. "Your father built something good," she said. "He did," Nathan agreed. "And you built something good from it." "We're building something," he said. "We're not done." She nodded once. "No, we're not done." Chumpchika. Spring came. The way spring always comes. In Wyoming reluctantly, then all at once. The columbine seeds went in the south yard in the second week of April, and the wild rose cuttings went in beside them, and Eleanor stood in the dirt with her hands dark from the soil, and her hair coming loose from its pins, and the warmth of a real spring sun on her face. And Nathan came out with 2 cups of coffee and handed her one, and stood beside her, looking at the turned earth. "They won't bloom until summer," she said. "I know. You might not even see the full bloom until next year." "I've got time," he said. She looked at him sideways. "Who are you?" she said. "And what have you done with the man who told me in October that sentiment was impractical?" "He got outvoted," Nathan said. Eleanor smiled. Tom Henley's voice came from the direction of the barn, telling Billy Marsh to stop letting the yearling follow him around like a dog. Billy's voice came back explaining that the yearling had started following him, and he hadn't encouraged it. Tom's voice said that was the same thing. Eleanor and Nathan stood in the south yard with their coffee and listened to the ordinary argument of a working ranch in April, and the sound was so completely essentially home that Eleanor held it in her chest for a moment to be sure she had it, the weight and warmth of it, the specific texture of this life she had built in a place that had spent years telling her she didn't belong here. She belonged here. She knew it the way you know things that have settled all the way down to the bone, not because anyone told you, not because the circumstances arranged themselves conveniently, but because you did the work and held the line and stayed when it would have been easier to go, and what grew from that was real in a way that nothing easy ever quite is. Hans Gruber asked me yesterday if I'd be willing to look at his winter accounts before he takes them to the bank, Eleanor said. What did you tell him? I told him yes. She paused. Clara Hatch's daughter wants to learn to read. She's 14 and she missed her schooling years when her mother was sick. Another pause. The school in town has a vacancy starting in September. Margaret Crane mentioned it. Nathan looked at her. Are you telling me you're thinking about applying for the school position? He said. I'm telling you I'm thinking about it, she said carefully. It would mean being in town 3 days a week. It would mean less time here. She looked at him. I'm not going to do anything that affects us without talking to you first. Nathan was quiet for a moment. Eleanor, he said, you've been here 5 months. You've managed this ranch's accounts, found 15 years of fraud, settled a water dispute that's been running since before my father died, helped 3 families in this county in ways that had nothing to do with your obligations to any of them, and you're asking me permission to teach school 3 days a week. She raised an eyebrow. I'm not asking permission. I'm telling you and asking your thoughts. There's a difference. Yes, she said. A significant one. My thoughts, Nathan said, are that the children in Red Willow Creek are lucky, and I don't need you here every day to know you're coming home. She looked at him steadily. Home, she said. Home, he said. She turned back to the garden and drank her coffee, and let the morning be what it was, warm and real and ordinary, in the best sense of that word. Ordinary meaning it was hers this morning. This life, this man standing beside her in the south yard. The last thing Martin Reed tried was a letter directly to the Territorial Land Office. It arrived in late April, and Eleanor found out about it through the Land Office investigator Robert Ames, who sent Nathan a brief note saying that a letter had been received making unsubstantiated claims about the Walker property application, and that the letter had been reviewed, found to contain no new verifiable information, and filed accordingly. Filed accordingly. Eleanor read the note twice. Filed accordingly. 5 years of being defined by a story someone else had told about the worst moment of her life, and when Martin Reed tried to weaponize it against federal investigators who had already sat in her kitchen and watched her manage things, it had been filed. She sat with that for a few minutes. Then she folded the note and put it in the document box with the other important papers, and went back to the school application she was completing at the kitchen table. Nathan came in from the North Ridge inspection. They were planning the fence extension, now the first actual use of the land they'd won in January, and she showed him the note without comment. He read it. He set it down. He poured coffee. Is that the end of it? He said. I think so, Eleanor said. Martin Reed has now tried a legal notice, an anonymous letter, and a federal complaint. All 3 have been dismissed or filed accordingly. She picked up her pen. At some point, even Martin Reed is going to run out of mechanisms. And when he does, she looked up at him. Then it's done. Nathan sat down across from her. He looked at the application she was filling out. The school board meets next week, he said. Wednesday. I'll drive you. Nathan, I've been driving myself places since I was 18. I know, he said. I want to drive you. There's a difference. She looked at him, the same distinction she'd made to him about permission and consultation given back to her with the same precision. Yes, she said, there is. She went back to the application. He went back to the fence plans. They worked at the kitchen table in the late afternoon light, and the house was quiet and warm and full of the sounds of 2 people getting on with the business of a shared life. and outside the south yard garden was turning green at the edges, where the columbine was beginning to push up through the cold earth. Not blooming yet, but there, growing as things do when they have been planted with care in soil that has been prepared to receive them. Meow. On the last Wednesday in April, Eleanor Walker stood in front of the Red Willow Creek School Board and was offered the teaching position before she had finished answering the second question. The board chair, a retired farmer named Albert Voss, Patricia's husband, which Eleanor had not known until she sat down, looked at her credentials, which she had written out carefully on 3 pages of her most exact handwriting, and then looked at her face. "Mrs. Walker," he said, "I'm going to be plain with you." "Please," she said. "This board has been trying to fill this position for 2 years. We had 3 candidates before you. All 3 came in with more formal education than you're showing here." He set the pages down. All 3 left town within 6 months because the work was harder than they expected, and the pay wasn't enough to make up for that. He folded his hands. "My wife came home on Saturday and spent about 45 minutes telling me about a conversation that happened in the church hall. I wasn't going to mention it, but..." He glanced at the other 2 board members. "I think we've been doing this wrong, looking for credentials instead of character." Eleanor looked at him steadily. "The position is yours if you want it," Albert Voss said, "starting in September." Eleanor looked at her hands for a moment. Then she looked up. "I want it," she said. Nathan was waiting outside with the wagon. She came down the courthouse steps, and he read her face before she said a word. "Well," he said. "September," she said. He smiled, not the small controlled expression she'd first seen from him. The real one, the one she'd worked on getting out of him for 5 months, the one that changed the entire quality of his face and made him look like a younger man and made her feel every single time like she had been given something rare. He jumped down from the wagon and was in front of her in 3 steps, and he took her face in both hands and kissed her right there on the courthouse steps in the middle of Red Willow Creek, and she held the front of his coat with both hands and kissed him back. From somewhere on the main street, someone whistled. Someone else, she would later determine it was Billy Marsh, who had come into town for supplies and had absolutely no self-control, cheered. Eleanor pulled back and looked at Nathan. "People are watching," she said. "Good," he said. She laughed. He kept his hands on her face for one more moment, this man who had signed a paper next to a stranger 4 months ago and called it survival, who had said in October that marriage was supposed to be built on love and not paperwork, and had then, against his own stated position, fallen entirely in love with the woman the paperwork had given him. "I need to tell you something," Eleanor said. "Again. It's important." "All right." She held his coat and looked at him directly, the way she looked at everything that mattered. "Whatever I expected when I walked into that church," she said, "it was less than this. I want you to know that. Whatever I was braced for, a fair man, a decent arrangement, a workable life, I want you to know that this is more. Significantly more." Nathan's hands were warm against her face. "Good," he said. "Because I plan to keep exceeding your expectations." "That," she said, "is either a promise or a threat." "Both," he said, "depending on the day." She shook her head once the way she did when he made her laugh, and she was trying not to. She climbed into the wagon. He climbed up beside her. They drove home through the April morning with the windows of Red Willow Creek catching the light behind them, and ahead of them, the valley opened up wide and green at its edges, and the mountains stood clear against the sky, and the North Ridge. Their North Ridge with the fence extension going in, and the water rights settled, and the land that Nathan's father had protected without knowing exactly who he was protecting it for, was visible from the top of the last hill before the ranch lane. Eleanor looked at it. 20 years, she said. Your father sat on that problem for 20 years. He was patient, Nathan said. He was right, she said, about the foundation. Nathan looked at her sideways. What about the foundation? That if you build it right, she said, it holds. Even when everything on top of it gets damaged. Even when you can't see it anymore through the damage. She paused. The foundation holds, and eventually the right person finds it and understands what it was built for. Nathan was quiet for a moment. He thought about a marriage that had started as paperwork and obligation, and the woman who had walked into his church with her chin up and kept it up through every single thing this town and this county and Martin Reed and Gerald Hendricks and the weight of 5 years of someone else's cruelty had thrown at her. He thought about the way she had sat in his study on a Saturday night and said, "What I cannot survive is being chosen," because the timing was convenient, and the way she had, then despite every reason not to chosen to believe him when he said the timing wasn't what made it true. He thought about Columbine pushing up through cold soil. He thought about the foundation. "He built it for this," Nathan said. "He just didn't know what this would look like." Eleanor looked at him. "Neither did I," she said. He reached over and took her hand. She held on. The wagon rolled down the lane toward the Walker Ranch, and the morning was clear, and the mountains were visible, and ahead of them was a life that had been built from the most unlikely materials, obligation and paperwork, and a town full of people who didn't know what they had in their midst, and had become through the daily choosing of two people who didn't stop when it was hard, something that would last. The woman this town had called the old maid of Red Willow Creek held the hand of the cowboy who had been forced to marry her, and looked at the land that was hers as much as his, and knew with the certainty of someone who has earned what they have through patience and dignity, and the refusal to become less than they are, that she had not been unwanted. She had simply been waiting for the right person to see her clearly, and the cowboy who finally did would never stop being grateful that he had opened his eyes in time. That was not the ending of their story. It was the beginning of the one that mattered.